that hour on Friday is my hour. And since he and I have totally different political views, we finally decided the best way to handle this is to focus on what I really do most effectively, and that is economic analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't take phone calls because when we had the political thing, it was driven by phone calls, and most of the calls were in my favor. So he said, why don't we talk about economics, because it's such an important subject.
Yeah.
So that's what we do now.
And he's real good for the veterans too. I think he's very patriot
is,
with the military, and
Steve
he's a good guy.
He's one of the finest minds I've ever met as far as knowing things and getting background.
Yeah.
And so, as a matter of fact, on December the 2nd, at the library, he and I are going to be holding forth at the Ranch Mirage Library.
Oh.
Yeah, we're scheduled.
Oh, you are? Oh,
yeah.
I might have to come over there. I live at Mission Hills, so it's
If
close by.
you can, that would be great.
Yeah, I'd like to do
because we put on a good show.
Oh, I'm sure you do. Okay, I'm going to introduce you here now.
Sure.
Good morning. Today is 16 November, the year 2011. I'm Dr. Dave Thompson, a volunteer at the Palm Springs Air Museum here in Palm Springs, California. As part of the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., we conduct interviews of veterans and civilians who participated in our country's military conflicts. Today, I'm here at the museum and have the honor and the privilege of interviewing Captain Morrie Beschloss. Captain Beschloss was a psychological warfare officer in the U.S. Army from 1952 to 1960. So we're going to talk to him about that and a lot of other things. Morrie, so good to have you here.
David, it's great to be with you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now I'm going to kind of get you lined up here. Okay.
Well, I was very sad about Lindy's passing.
Thank you. Yeah, it was. It was.
Yeah, well, he and I, I was his confidant.
Oh, were you?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
He, and he was my mentor, and so at the rosary and the stuff on the night before, people got up and talked a little bit about Lindy, and I mentioned that too, that without him I wouldn't be where I am.
He was a one, but he made the mistake that most people I know that retire make, and he was a great golfer, and he totally focused on golf, and once he no longer could play, his whole world literally collapsed. I hate to say that, but that's
true. It's true, absolutely. He and his son
I mean,
Billy and I were talking about that, and both felt the same way.
Yeah, unfortunately, I was just there on Sunday because I had to go. I'm a chairman of a group down in Houston that's business related, but it's primarily energy, oil, natural gas, and so on.
Yeah.
So I had to leave early Monday morning.
Okay. Well, first of all, would you spell and pronounce your full name for us?
Yes, my full name is Morris R. Beschloss. The last name is spelled Beschloss.
And when and where were you born?
I was born on March 7th, 1929, in Berlin, Charlottenburg. I always mention Charlottenburg because that's the home of the Kaiser and the royalty of Prussia.
Ah, okay. And obviously that's in Germany.
Yes,
and
capital of Germany.
The capital of Germany, yes. And 1929, so that makes you how many years young now?
I'm 83 and a half years old.
Oh my gosh, Morrie, you look great.
I know.
I bet you feel great too.
I feel great, but when I have this 1-hour TV show on Time Warner and I radio and also with the newspaper, I usually don't like tell my age. Do you know why? Because people stereotype ages, and most people, even in the 70s, usually don't take any active positions. So I don't want to get people confused. Some of the kids over TV, they think I'm in my 60s, and I don't.
Well, I'm sure. Well,
I don't disabuse them.
No. My wife's uncle, who was like a father to her, died a couple of years ago at 99, and up until once he got to be about 90, because he looked younger than that too. Then he he was kind of proud of how old he was. But up until that time, when anyone asked him, he would say, "Age is just a number, and mine is unlisted." Right. You've heard that.
Well, they had it. I do this daily blog for the Desert Sun, which is sponsored by the Gannett Publishing Company. I got about 120,000 readers. They had my age on there. My wife said, "You get them to take that age out of there." They did.
Yeah.
So I don't want this.
That's good. Yeah.
I don't want this to be a stereotype for people that don't know me.
Now, and what did your father do?
My father was a medical doctor.
Oh, and what was his name?
Ottokar.
Okay.
That's Ottokar, named after a famous Bohemian prince in what is now the Czech Republic.
Okay. And have you traced your family history on your father's side?
Yes,
tell me a little bit about that. How far back did you go?
It's a very interesting history. We are direct descendants of Jan Sobieski III, the greatest king that Poland ever had. By any Polish person will tell you that. Yeah. He was the one that broke the Turkish siege of Vienna in 1683, when the Turks, the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman II, was ready to break into Vienna. They had besieged Vienna, they were ready to break in, and my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather organized 400 cavalrymen, put artificial wings of angels on their back, and they came out of the Viennese hills in the twilight. And the Turks that were besieging Vienna saw this, their encampment, and they panicked. They saw these were the avenging angels coming out of heaven to drive them out, and that broke the siege. And my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was, of course, given credit for this. Oh. And I know even in the Catholic Church, he's venerated as a great Christian liberator for keeping the Turks and of course, the Muslims out of Central Europe, because at that time, this was just after the few years after the 30 Years' War, where the Protestants and the Catholics had decimated each other, and the Turks could have walked right into the rest of Europe, and everybody there would have been Muslim.
Yeah. Now, now your father, where did he go to medical school?
My father was Viennese. He was a officer in the First War, fighting for the Austro-Hungarian army on the Italian front. He got 2 Iron Crosses. Wow. One personally presented to him by the Emperor Franz Joseph. Mm. And to make it even more interesting, he had a first sergeant that he said should have gotten the award, because he says the man was a fanatic. Everything he did was fanatic, like building a pontoon bridge underwater so that troops could cross. And his name was Josip Broz, better known as Tito.
Oh.
So
wow.
My father had he had a whole cachet of medals that were given to him. But you asked me about the medical school. He actually went to first in Vienna, but he got his degree in Bonn, Germany, which subsequently after the Second War became the capital of the German Federal Republic. Mm-hmm. But at that time, they were known for having an outstanding medical school, and that's how he got this desire to leave Austria, because once, because of our great President Wilson, when he just totally decimated both the Austro-Hungarian Empire by redrawing the map, Austria, there was just a vestige of its former self. He said it was basically Austria became a tiny little country made up of Vienna and the hinterland, and that was all that was left for Austria. So he felt as long as he was in a Germanic environment, he wanted to go into Germany. Timing was bad, but that's history.
And did he, other than the fact that Tito was his sergeant, and did he talk about any of the action that he saw? Oh,
yes. Yes, he was on the front for 3 years. And he became a lover of everything Italian. Do I have time to tell a quick story?
Oh, sure.
After my father became the head of the Social Democratic Doctors Movement in Germany before the Hitler era, which started in 1933. And when Kristallnacht took place on November 9th, 1938, he was on the list to be taken to concentration camps because he was Jewish. And his uncle's wife's first cousin was Governor Lehman of New York, and Governor Lehman had sent $30,000 to Batista, the president of Cuba, to get him out of there. Not to get him out of there, but to send a boat to pick him up in Hamburg. Interestingly, the Social Democrats didn't fight against the Nazis, but they had an underground movement, especially moving Jews out of Germany. And he got from Berlin to Hamburg through the auspices of this underground movement. And when he went to Hamburg, there was a banana boat waiting for him to take him to Cuba. He was the only passenger on it. I remember the name of the banana boat. It was called the Orinoco. Mm. And he lived in Cuba for about a year and a half. My mother and my brother and I, we were able to leave Germany in February of 1939. And we landed on my 10th birthday. And my father joined us just a year and a half later.
You landed where?
We landed in New York.
Oh, okay.
But fortunately, my mother had uncles in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Chicago, but she chose Pittsburgh because three of her most prominent uncles, one was a chief engineer of Gulf Oil, one had a big furniture company, another one had a big food company. So you had to have somebody vouch for them to get an affidavit and a visa to go to the United States.
And you remember the ship that you were on?
Yes. The ship was the SS Manhattan, which was a sister ship of the St. Louis, known as the Voyage of the Damned.
Right.
When they took out, there's an interesting little byplay here. It took $30,000 to get my father quickly out of Germany into Cuba. $45,000 would have gotten the people on the St. Louis to land in Havana, but the Jewish agency refused to pay that because they already had paid Batista something up front, and he said, I need $45,000 more. They wouldn't give him the money. So I consider them co-conspirators to the fact that I condemn both Batista in Cuba, the Jewish agency, and Franklin Roosevelt for not allowing that ship to land its occupants in Miami when the German Captain Schroeder, who turned out to be an anti-Nazi, tried to beach the ship near Miami so that those people could get off. Roosevelt told the Coast Guard to blast the ship out of the water if they dare do that. So this is just one of those little historical side issues.
What was his reasoning for not allowing that?
Are you aware of my son's background as a presidential historian? Michael Beschloss is considered the preeminent presidential historian, and he wrote a book about this subject, about Roosevelt, and it was called The Conquerors, about the aftermath of the war against Germany and Japan and the role that Roosevelt played. And he got all the facts about it. He said Roosevelt had an absolute fear that if he did something that overtly helped the Jews of Europe, it would keep him from being reelected. That there would be a absolute, and he was at that time thinking about a third term, which was unprecedented. Okay. Yeah. So he even made the statement that if you think there's blood in the streets in Berlin, wait till you see what happens in New York if I let a bunch of Jews into this country.
And your mother, what was her name and her maiden name?
She was born in Ukraine, and she came to Vienna as a movie starlet. And my father fell immediately in love with her. He was engaged to another woman. He saw her and fell in love with her.
And what was her name?
Her name was Manya, M-A-N-Y-A. It's a Russian name. And I guess the Russian name was Labunskaya, but it would be like Levine in this country. So,
now, okay, and was she Jewish also?
yes.
Okay, and your dad was. Now, but when did his family become Jewish? Because I'm assuming back in the 1600s when they probably weren't.
That's a very good question. Oh, careful.
Yeah.
We obviously are of mixed heritage. I mean, there's no question about it.
Yeah.
Because he said there was the son of Sobieski, whose English name would be James. And by the way, Warsaw at that time, the Duchy of Warsaw, the aristocrats spoke either French or German. He always said that Polish was for priests and peasants. And Poland never had a middle class because whenever they were partitioned and occupied, the middle class was exterminated. So I say they had the very low class and they had the priests. And anyway, James could not succeed his father because Poland at that time had electors like we have. You were king, you were like a president for life. And he spoke German. And in order to give him something, they built a beautiful house by the king's palace called the Villa Neuve, which is the new house. Actually, it was a little white house. In fact, it was known in our recent history when Carter was in war, so he stayed at that place. And in order to give him some distinction, in those days they did the surnames. They didn't have it like Thompson or. So he took on the name James by Dame Schloss, which means James by the King's Palace. By Dame Schloss became Beschloss, and Beschloss became Beschloss. That's how our name of you see, history's in every part of our family's life. So yes, he said there was a family, the first cousins. One was identified as having some Jewish background, the other ones were Catholic. And they were all part of the Sobieski family. They were named the Bobzinskis. I said, whatever happened to the Bobzinskis? You see, he doesn't know.
You're talking about how his name derived on down. My middle name is my mother's maiden name, which is Hayden, Hayden, and I've traced that back like to the 1100s in England. And this group, they lived on a high down, which is a hill that's flat on the top. And so they were people that lived on the high down, which eventually became the high down.
This is interesting. That's how these kind of names.
I know.
You know, everybody can't be a baker and a miller, and you know, it's nice to have a distinctive name.
Yeah.
By the way, there is nobody else in the world other than my brother and I and our descendants who have the name Beschloss.
Really? Oh.
It's also the name is also a verb in German. Beschloss, spelled exactly the same way, means decided. So my father, after Hitler was propelled into the Führership, once he had to go to Munich on business, and he said there was a statue of Hitler there, and it said on it, "Here Hitler beschloss Politiker zu werden." That means here Hitler decided to become a politician. So everybody saw it. He said, "How'd you get your name next to Hitler?"
And I think you mentioned, well, how many brothers and sisters?
I have an older brother. That's it.
And what's his name?
Max.
And is he still?
His name is Maximilian Zygmunt. Maximilian, of course, after the Emperor Maximilian, who the ill-fated emperor who died in Mexico, was shot by Juarez's people. Yes, he's still alive. He's living in an assisted living area in northern New Jersey.
Oh, okay. And so you were telling me tell me about growing up in
I had a very, I'd say rather interesting, I was going to use the word turbulent. It wasn't really turbulent. It was very interesting, to say the least.
And where do you remember the house that you grew up in?
I certainly do. We've been back there.
And where was that?
That was in a place called Staaken, which is right next to Spandau, which became infamous because Hess was incarcerated there. And I remember that big red fortress that he was incarcerated in, because they had a big pond in front where my brother and I went ice skating as kids. We lived only about 5 minutes away from that area.
Now, Hess is the one that jumped on a plane and came out of England?
On May 13th, 1941, he parachuted over Scotland with an idea of getting in touch with the Cliveden set, who were pro-German in England, and trying to work out a deal that they could make peace with England while Germany was getting ready to invade the Soviet Union.
So Hitler probably didn't like that, or did he care?
Nobody quite knows. There's some people that Hitler was very, believe it or not, he was an Anglophile.
Yes, initially.
And a lot of people think that Hitler really, there was no way that Hess could have done this without Hitler's knowledge, if not his approval, if not his provocation. And because if he could have gotten a peace with England, which he couldn't, obviously with Churchill there, that was impossible, but he was naive to think if they worked with some of the top people in the government, they could work it out. The last segment of that little incident, right after the war, in the English zone there was a castle, and it was raided by British commandos, and they took all the papers out of there because it named names of people who had worked with the Nazis that were high up in the British autocracy. So, there's all kind of little stories come out of that.
And what ultimately, how did Hess end up?
Hess, at the age of 92, supposedly committed suicide. He did not, in my estimation, he couldn't. He was committed suicide with a cord around his neck from an electrical wiring system. That's impossible. I think the British killed him so to keep his mouth shut, because he was getting ready to talk about his experiences. He was 92 years old, but in marvelously good mental and physical shape. So that's one of those untold stories.
Yeah. Okay. You told me a little bit about getting into the Hitler Youth. Tell me that story again.
Yeah, this was very fascinating. I was, I have to admit, as a kid, I was very bellicose, I guess is the word. I was always getting into fights, and I was well known as a Lausbub, which was a German word for a real tough kid, always making trouble. And
excuse me, did you live in a Jewish community?
No.
No.
I never met any Jewish people other than my father knew some, and they came to visit at our house. But this was a place called Staaken, which was right next to Spandau. And Staaken there were two airports in Berlin at that time. One was Tempelhof, which was a major airport, and the second one was Staaken, which was where the dirigibles, the Zeppelins, took off. And I was there, by the way, when the Hindenburg took off for an ill-fated flight to Lakehurst, New Jersey, in 1937. So I saw a little history being made. But it was a small town. In fact, we lived there in a townhouse waiting to develop an estate that my father was going to build right next to the Tegelsee, which is a beautiful part of Berlin. They had a lot of lakes around there. And then, of course, when Hitler came in, that was impossible. So we stayed at this house where he also had his medical office. And the school was maybe 8 minutes walking from our house. So my basic life pretty much was centered in this little Staaken area. And the day that I was going in to be in what the equivalent of the first grade in Germany. In Germany, for some reason, they started with the 8th grade and then they go backwards.
Oh.
But anyway, it was like the first grade. And as I came in, I was told that I was to go to the principal's office immediately. Now, that was very unusual for a 6-year-old kid, because a principal in Germany had much more official standing than they have here in this country. It had to be cleared at the central headquarters in Berlin. So this man was an appointee of the German government. I walked into his office, and he was standing there with the vice principal next to him, and my German name, which was my first name, was Ulrich. which we changed when I came here because I couldn't, Ulrich Beschloss, you might as well have the German flag behind you. And my name, I changed it to Morris Richard. And so he said, Ulrich, we want you to know we consider you 100% Aryan. I learned years later, in fact, the Military Channel, if you ever watched that, had a 2-hour program on Jews that fought with Hitler, not against Hitler, but fought with him. And they were quarter Jews, half Jews. And in there, they brought out the fact there was what they called an ability for a man in official position to Aryanize whoever he thought was good for the Vaterland. And the most phenomenal example of that is Erhard Milch. Have you ever heard that name? He was the chief of the German Air Force. Now, Goering, of course, was involved in it, but this is the guy that built it up and became a field marshal. He was a full-blooded Jew. Of course, they said he was, they try to play all kind of games with that. But he was, by the way, was prosecuted at Nuremberg in 1945-46 and was sentenced to life imprisonment, but they let him out after 7 years. Well, that's what's called the Aryanization. So I learned later on that this was done by the rector, which is a German word for the principal, because they felt I totally fit the definition of an enthusiastic, angry young Aryan. They had different reasons for it. I think they also figured there was no way they were going to let me be Jewish because it would destroy their propaganda. I was just about the antithesis of what they tried to propagandize a Jew to be like. A troublemaker, fighting, tough kid, also very good student. And
good in sports?
Very good. I was a great soccer player, which was a big game, yeah. But I also continued to get into fights. There was one incident which you'll get a kick out of. There was a local Gestapo chief in town, and everybody knows that you don't mess with the Gestapo. Well, this kid one day started to give me a hard time, and he says, "You dirty Jew," and I jumped on him and I beat the living daylights out of him. The next day, my mother, who was a beautiful woman, she was a movie starlet, so you can imagine she was very elegant. Everybody just paid homage to her. And the Gestapo chief called her in. He says, "Frau Beschloss, you got to do something about that crazy son of yours, because if Alexanderplatz hears about this, we're all in trouble." Alexanderplatz was the national headquarters of the Gestapo. And he said, we know the circumstances, but they will not be so quick to understand those circumstances. So,
was that mostly what you thought about, being Jewish and getting picked on for that, or just anything?
No. That's a very good question. No, not. There was some of that. My brother was very urbane. He was 2 years older than me, and he was more of a cosmopolitan type, and he didn't get involved. He stayed away from it. And me, I was looking for a fight. You looked at me cross-eyed. I was ready to fight. I hate to admit this, but that was my nature. I've sort of toned down a little bit since that time. But so anyway, I was then Aryanized, but also was put in a distinguished position of being one of the top students in the whole school to get favors. And one of the favors was to go to the Olympics in 1936 and to see the whole Olympics, including Jesse Owens's 4 winning medals, where he won the various dashes, including the quarter mile, or the 400 meter. And I saw when Hitler walked out so he wouldn't have to give a medal to a black man. And they said it was there was no weather that day. It was a beautiful sunny day without a cloud. But the other event, which I've told you about, which I consider very unique, and it's been written about, is that I was one of 6 kids that was supposed to be at the station when Hitler and Mussolini were coming up from Munich, where they had signed the Pact of Steel between Italy and Germany in 1937. And the train was going to go by, we had a train station in our town where the train would go through. So I was one of 6 that was sent to the station to salute the train as it went by. Well, the train didn't go by, it stopped. And for some reason, Mussolini and 2 or 3 Balilas, which was the Italian youth movement, came out, and I remember with their fur hats and tassels, which we were immediately jealous of because that was a flair of the Italians. And they came out, and then to everybody's amazement, the Fuhrer came out also, and he saw us standing there, and I was standing on the far left, which was, based on my political leanings since then, was kind of a unique position for me to be in. And he came by and he looked at me and patted me on the head, and for a few seconds while he was looking at me, I was totally transfixed and hypnotized. He had these very dark blue eyes, but they captured me, like he was drawing me right into him. And I'll never forget this. This is an event that I remember a lot of things, but this was very poignant.
And I was wondering if that hypnotic effect was unique to you, or just about everybody that Hitler got involved
What's
with.
been written since then was a Dr. Morrie, who was one of his chief advisors, and this man was known as being an expert on the occult. And a lot of things that Hitler did was by communicating with the occult. Now, you can make anything out of that you want. I mean, if you believe in Satan and Satanism, it's very possible. I happen to believe it is. I'll tell you why. And nobody seems to be able to get to the point of this. His hatred of the Jews was more, it's been taught in the Christian churches. The Catholic Church certainly promoted anti-Semitism. I mean, this is not a secret. Everybody knows that until John the 23rd put a stop to it, and of course John Paul I also. But this idea of killing all the Jews, nobody, the most in the 2,000-year history of Christianity, even the most vile anti-Semite never talked about genocide. I mean, this is why, and nobody seems to be able to do this. I happen to believe it was a satanic order. Now, that may be a little far-fetched, but that's my belief. There is no humanistic way to explain this any other way. It also explains to some extent how he captivated the German people. Now, a lot of that was due to the fact that when he finally took power through machinations of one sort or another, Germany had a 25% unemployment rate. Within 6 months, there was no unemployed. Everybody was working, making guns, tanks, planes, ships, whatever, and also building the Autobahn. And, people are people. If somebody comes in and gives them a full lunch pail and gives them work, he becomes a messiah. And he was able to do it so quickly. So they looked the other way when a lot of Germans, of course, fell prey to his vicious propaganda. But the other ones, I'd say the majority of the people just went along with it because it gave them a lot of goodies.
Mm-hmm. And was your family very religious? Did you go to temple, or was there one in your town?
You're asking some very good questions. No, there was no. There was a Jewish synagogue in Spandau, which was more urbane. Spandau was next to Berlin-Charlottenburg, where I was born, and my mother was religious, and my father was, I would say, he was not I would say he was an agnostic, and he was a Zionist. He believed in the recreation of the state of Israel. That was very important. And of course, after the war, he really became a fanatical Zionist, few years that he lived beyond the Second War. But my mother was very religious. So, can you imagine, for 3 days a week after school, I attended my troop. You know, did all the little work like digging ditches, and it's like the German military Boy Scout movement.
Like the Hitler.
Then the other 2 days I went to Spandau for Jewish studies. I think I learned more about the history of the Jewish people in Spandau, by the way it was taught, than I ever learned when I came to the United States after being 10 years old. Was much the educational methods which were far better. The education I got in Germany, even as a kid, was much more profound. Maybe it was because my years were more formative. But you know, right across from this beautiful building where there was a synagogue but also a teaching school was the SS headquarters in Spandau. They weren't, while I was there was no trouble. But, you know, that came later.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, it was kind of a mixed picture.
So, I mean, did you, you were 10 years old when you left there? Is that what you said?
We landed in New York on my 10th birthday.
Okay.
So
in those 10 years that you were there, were you aware of the Jews were being mistreated and all this kind of stuff?
Hitler was devilishly clever. He did things by degrees. The Nuremberg laws in 1934 forbade Jews working for the government. They could not participate in any organizations that were pseudo-government oriented. Even they could not go to parks. They could not go to the movies. They could not participate in any activities. Now, the obvious question is, well, how come they stayed there? Nobody wanted them. They couldn't. This is one of the great criminal things the British didn't. The British probably did a better job than anybody. They had what they called the Kindertrain, where orphaned kids were allowed to come out of Germany, and the British accepted them. But every other country, the only other country, believe it or not, that accepted them was the Shanghai, which was of course occupied by the Japanese. And if you could get your way there, then when the Japanese took over, they didn't do anything to me any more than they did to any other white person that lived there. And the only other country, there were two other countries. One was Ecuador and the Dominican Republic. But they were, that was only a small number that went there. And so the Jews were, but also when you have generation of history in a country, you don't have the benefit of what happens in the future. Mm-hmm. The one thing my father always said, his mother was really the matriarch of the family, and her husband had died. I never knew my grandfather. He died in 1925. But her companion was the chief of staff of the German army, Hans Fritsch, chief of staff of the German army, who turned out to be an anti-Nazi, and he was given a choice at the time when Germany invaded Poland, either to be prosecuted, of course, probably with a death sentence, or to die on the Polish front, and he chose the latter. But at the time, he told my grandmother that when Hitler finally, after the Austrian occupation, annexation, if he tries to take over Czechoslovakia, the British and the French will probably come in, and the Russians had said that they would join the British and the French. And at that point, we have two armored divisions at Döberitz, about 20 kilometers outside of Berlin. We're going to go into Berlin, and we're going to arrest him and probably shoot him and take over and declare military dictatorship. And my father thought that was going to happen. It was very naive, because by the time Hitler made his deal with Marshal Blomberg, who was head of the German army, the deal was, get rid of your stormtroopers and we'll obey you. Don't get rid of the stormtroopers, don't expect us to support you. So that's why on July 30th, 1934, they call it the Night of the Long Lives. They shot Ernst Röhm, his best friend, who was head of the SA, and they got rid of all the top guys in the stormtroopers. And from then on, they were no longer a factor. The Army and the SS became the big thing in Germany.
It was the Night of the Long Knives.
Night of the Long Knives was July 30th, 1934.
Yeah, I was putting together for our docent training program. They wanted a video, relatively short, maybe 30 minutes, of the prelude to war up until 1941 when we got in. But I did one segment about 30 minutes on Europe and another on the Pacific, and had little clips of a lot of the documentaries that we have, and part of it was about that, the Night of the Long Knives.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh,
In fact, I might, if you wouldn't mind, if you get a chance to take a look at it, see if there's any improvement.
I would be happy to.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
By the way, if I can be of any assistance to you in the future, I'm very anxious to have these stories told, because in my industry, I got a major award of being the outstanding person in my industry. I got, in fact, that picture of getting the presentation.
Oh, right.
Mickey.
She sent. I've got it. Yeah.
That was.
That's right.
And one of the top distributors in the industry, who's very venerated as a leading guy himself in the distributions, he calls me the industry's institutional memory. So if I can be.
Oh well, yes.
All you have
We'll
to do
get
is
together
call me.
after. Well,
Yes.
We'll talk about that. There's plenty of stuff that I would love for you to help out with. Okay, so, and your father, well, obviously he got out because he could see the horizon. So
Well,
tell me how that kind of, and how did it affect him and his practice and that sort of stuff?
Well, he was venerated in this town as the Dr. Beschloss. Again, being a doctor there gave you tremendous prominence. He was the only physician in town. And give you an interesting example. My grandmother's brother had stayed in Austria, and he became the chief purchasing agent for the Austrian army. And but he had also converted. He chose to do the thing that would be given the least amount of guilt. He did not become a Catholic, which was the religion of Austria. About 98%. There were 2% that were Protestant. So he became a Protestant. And so he was accepted by the new conquerors of Austria, and they kept him on in his position because he was very good at what he did. So he came to our home one night in 1938, obviously after the annexation, and when he was there, there was the local Nazis made a demonstration in front of our house. It was the first time they ever did this, because they always treated my father, even during this period, as a very nice, but I guess that was ordered from Berlin. The next day, of course, my uncle was very disturbed, and we never saw him again after that. But the next day, my father got 20 anonymous phone calls from people that had participated in this demonstration, asking him for forgiveness, which is kind of interesting about the at least there was some good in people who realized you can't be in the abstract and hating a whole group when it affects somebody who's a part of that group that you know and are good people.
Yeah. And were most of the Austrians glad that the Germans
Oh, absolutely.
they were annexed?
Absolutely. Schuschnigg, who was the Chancellor of Austria, was going to call for a plebiscite to see whether the Austrians wanted to join Germany, and Hitler was afraid it would go against him, so he preempted this plebiscite and said the army. But they would have won it by hands down. The Austrians were far more Nazified than the Germans. Even after the war, there was a guy named Jürgen Haider, a neo-Nazi, who actually got the most votes in one of the parliamentary elections. So they haven't changed that much, in my opinion.
Yeah. So tell me again a little bit about how it was that your dad got out, and then you and your mom.
Yeah, my father got out, first of all, to save his life, really, because of being in the prominent position he was as chief social democrat.
Okay, now by this time, though, you're in Germany, right?
Oh, no, we were still in Germany. This was
in-
November 9th, 1938, or
Right.
this, no, November 10th.
Yes.
And my father got into Hamburg and got out.
But what prompted it? I mean, what did he see?
Well, the fact that the Nazis burned down synagogues and businesses and killed several hundred Jews and had 30,000 that they sent to concentration camps. And this was, by the way, precipitated by the murder of a third secretary of the German embassy in Paris. This guy's name was von Rath, and it turned out that he was an anti-Nazi. The guy was trying to get to the ambassador, but he had a gun and he shot von Rath instead because he couldn't. They were going to grab him. And the irony of this whole thing is that Goering and Hitler uses it as a pretext.
Was the guy Jewish that shot?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Herschel. His name was Herschel Greenspan.
Okay.
And he was Jewish. Of course, that was the perfect pretext, just like the Reichstag fire was a perfect pretext to take over Germany, which was still on a constitution at that time. And the reason for it was Jelmer von Schacht, who was a German finance minister, had come to Goering about a month or so before, and he said, you know, all this building up, secret building up of our military has gotten us into a 12 billion mark deficit in our budget. And with the horrible situation of 1922 and 23, when Germany had one of the worst inflation any country ever had, if this gets out, this may create a panic. So Goering said, I'm going to try to think of something. And he came up and he wanted to find out what the value of Jewish businesses and synagogues were in Germany if they were destroyed, burned. And it turned out it was exactly 12 billion marks. Again, it's a story that's never been told. And that was a pretext to get the budget balance, but it also played in the hands of Hitler because this was November the 9th, which was not long after Chamberlain caved in at Munich. That was in October. So the thing is that these little historical things, which most people are not aware of, all have a basic reason behind them. Yeah. And this was, of course, my mother then got to work real fast to get in touch with her relatives, and went through the U.S. Embassy because she got. It was not really difficult. She said that they had an inside track because our people in the United States had influence. So yeah, it's unfortunate. If you've got influence and you're outstanding, you can make things happen. If you're just another one of the victims, your fate is in the hands of the murderers.
And you said she had relatives in Pennsylvania, was it?
She had 3 uncles in Pittsburgh. She had an uncle in New York and another uncle in Chicago.
Did you have relatives that did not get out? And if so, do you know what happened to them?
Yes, I had. My grandmother didn't get out, and this is unfortunately. I said she was a matriarch of the family. She believed in Germany, German culture. She was the one that instilled me with German patriotism. I mean, she was the closest to me, more so than my mother or my father, and she was the one that educated me, because my mother and father they had a chalet down in Italy. Because my father was such an Italophile and spoke perfect Italian, among other languages. So my grandmother pretty much educated me in my preferences and my lack of preferences. So she had a very large Swiss banking account. And as late as 1942, she was still able to get on a train and go to Zurich. And why didn't she stay there? She was almost blind, had blind faith in the German people. And in 1943, she was arrested and sent to Theresienstadt, which was a transit camp, and eventually was sent to an extermination camp. And there's a little side issue here. When I was in Prague with another gentleman, I don't know if you know Don Rubin.
Yes.
Yeah, well, Don, Jeanette, and Ruth and I went on a trip, Paris, London, and Prague, and Berlin. And we were at Terezin, which is the Czech name for the place now. And when I was there, I asked, is there any record of Morrie Beschloss? And they said, yeah, they had the whole record. She came here in 1943. I said, what was the date? It was August 18th, 1943. Do you know the date that we were there, that time with Reuben? August 18th, 1993. Exactly 50 years to the day. You know, again, you can make of this whatever you wish, but that's when we found out what happened to her.
How old was she at that time? Do you know?
She was born in 1873, so she would have been just about 70 years old. She was born on the 4th of July.
Oh, really? Yeah. Yeah. So, and your dad, I think you said that he ended up in Cuba. So tell me
He
about
ended up
that.
in Cuba, right?
And how did he get there?
On this banana boat. I mean, how he got there, or how did he get to the United States?
Well, to Cuba first, and how much, you were telling me how much it cost for him to get out?
$30,000 sent by Governor Herbert Lehman directly to President Fulgencio Batista.
But, okay, this is a relative in
He was my father's uncle's wife's first cousin.
and he lived in the United States? Or where did he
No,
live?
Herbert Lehman was the governor of New York.
The governor of New York.
Yeah,
Okay. All
a
right.
very famous governor.
Okay, so he sent 30,000
yes,
to
God bless
Batista.
him. We didn't know him, never met him,
Yeah.
but he did this without flinching.
So your dad got there, and so when did he end up and get to Cuba?
You mean
Yeah.
get to Cuba or
Get to Cuba, yeah.
I don't know how long it took him, but he was on that boat, and then
Yeah.
he was able to
That
practice
was
there.
1938, did you say?
38,
And
yes.
okay.
Yeah, he was able to practice there because they didn't ask him to go through his, like when he came to the United States eventually, he had to go through his internship
see.
and residency.
Oh,
But no, there they were happy to have another doctor, especially with his qualifications.
And your mother and you, when did you get to the States? You went directly to the States, right?
On my 10th birthday,
Okay.
March 7th, 1939.
Okay. And then when did your dad join you all?
This is again another little interesting story. Normally it would take about 5 years because of Roosevelt's antipathy toward Jewish refugees. I mean, that's been documented, not an opinion, it's a documented position. And he came in October 1940, so that would have been just about a year and a half later. Now, I'm not saying that this is the way it happened. I was told it could have happened this way. My uncle, who owned a chain of furniture stores, one day said, why don't you write a letter to the president? And because he saw, even though I was just learning English, he said, you seem to have a proclivity toward writing and communications. Little did he know. And he said, I said, the president is not going to listen to a little boy. I was 11 years old at the time. So he said, well, you never know. So I wrote a letter talking about the pathos of my father being in Cuba and my mother and my brother having to live apart from my father. So we received a letter back from one of the aides to Roosevelt, saying that, who obviously figured he'd take the letter and throw it in the wastebasket. He said, our president has a great amount of pathos for the Jewish refugees, and your story is very poignant, but, we get thousands of them. 2 weeks after this, we get this letter. My father calls us by transatlantic phone. In those days, we called from Havana to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Was transatlantic, be like calling from Mars today. And he said, I was just informed by the Consul General that I should have my affairs in order in the next 2 weeks and get ready to go to Miami.
Do you think Eleanor had anything to do with that?
I would say if anybody had anything to do with it, would be her.
Yeah, I would think
That's
so.
a very good point you just made. I never thought of that, but you're absolutely right. It was so un-Roosevelt-like. And he said there was nothing else that could have done it because he said there were hundreds and hundreds of people in Cuba that were way ahead of him. So how something had to happen to sort of jump him out.
By the way, did you learn English in Germany?
Couldn't speak 2 words. My brother was 2 years older, so he already had gone to what they call the middle schule, where he learned English, and he was a very smooth guy to begin with. You can imagine a little German, Ulrich Beschloss, it's exactly what you would expect to see.
Spell that first name for me.
Ulrich.
Oh,
It's a very Germanic German name.
Yeah. And does it mean anything? Or?
Yes, it comes from the word Eulenreich, which means having the wisdom of the owl. I learned that from my father. He liked that name, and it's you hear that name in Germany, usually in the military. People, a lot of Ulriches in the German army.
So did you live in New York when you came here?
Oh, thank God, no.
Where-
No, we went straight. We stayed in New York for just a few days
Yeah.
with my relatives there, but then we got on a train, and we went through Evansville, Indiana,
You did.
the New York Central,
Yeah.
and we got to. I'm sorry. The first trip was that came afterwards when we went to Illinois. We went by the Pennsylvania Railroad to Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh.
Yeah, that was late in March.
Mm-hmm. How long did you live in Pittsburgh?
From about April 1939 to August 1942.
Okay.
When I first, in those days, they didn't prepare you for school. If you didn't speak any English tough, you had to learn by the seat of your pants. So I walk into class, and you can just imagine the prototype of a little Nazi kid. I have to say that because, like people used to say, boy, Hollywood wanted a central casting Hitler Youth. I mean, this is a guy. So I walk in there. I wasn't too friendly, but I got along after a while. And I noticed that they were saying the Pledge of Allegiance. And while they were saying the Pledge of Allegiance, suddenly their arm goes up. Now, I don't know if you know this, but before Pearl Harbor, when we said at the Pledge of Allegiance, the arm went up and reaching out to the flag.
Oh, no, I didn't know that.
Yes, this is people that went to school in those days remember that very well. Of course, after 1937, it had a little different meaning. Excuse me, after December 7th, 1941. I mean, people knew about it, but they didn't put the two together until this happened. So I said, gee, this is where I came in. Now, interestingly, when we finally landed, my father became a doctor in downstate Illinois because he did not want his boys to be brought up in big cities. He said, the real Americana is in the English yeoman. He had this great love for the English yeoman, and he was not going to have us live in Morningside Heights in New York or on the south side of Chicago where they had this little immigrant colony. So he took a position in Taylorville, Illinois, which is about a town of 8,000 in southern Illinois, and that's where
How far from Carbondale is that?
Carbondale is much further south.
Okay.
Taylorville, Carbondale is where Southern Illinois University is located. Taylorville is about 28 miles from Springfield and also 28 miles from Decatur. The three would make a perfect triangle.
Oh, okay.
And he loved this town. I mean, he became the Dr. Christian. Do you remember that Gene Herschel, that radio program?
Oh, yeah.
He was a kind who would go out in the middle of the night and cater to his patients, whether they could pay or not pay. By the way, one of the people that he delivered and that I met when Taylorville had a celebrity weekend at the turn of this last century, I was called back along with guy that founded the Hubbard Street Dancers, and John Corzine. And John Corzine, when he met me, he said, "Are you related to Dr. Beschloss?" I said, "Yes, he's my father." He says, "That man was a saint. We loved him. He used to come out and take care of my family and never asked for any money." Well, the kind of money he had at that time, I was waiting for the check to be written, but it never came. But the interesting thing was, he said he was the man that delivered me.
Hmm. Did English come easy to you? Did it take you long to learn it? Or?
No, I worked hard at it. I was a fanatic in learning English. See, my brother, everything came easy to him. Everything came hard to me. And he made friends very easily. I did not. So I had to labor very hard over it.
And what were your impressions of the United States like when you first came here?
That's an exceptionally good question. I remember the first impression. We were on the Elevated in New York, and I saw this big billboard talking about Jewish rye bread. I said, you know, they're openly admitting that they're Jewish here. They're crazy. You know, I mean, I was going for, remember, I was totally indoctrinated in what was happening there, so the change. But once I began to see what was happening, I took on the protective coloring of a young man here in the United States. Very patriotic. I became intensely, I was very conservative from the very beginning. That was, from my background, that was natural. And to me, anybody that wasn't a patriot was an enemy of the country. That's how I viewed things in black and white fashion. When I came to Taylorville, I got into the scouting movement. I became an Eagle Scout, and I'm very proud to say that subsequently I became a distinguished Eagle Scout, which only 1/10 of 1% of all Eagle Scouts ever make. It's based on what contributions you've made to your profession or to academia, military, whatever. 2 presidents have gotten that, and in fact, Rick Perry is the only other person, and I met Rick Perry about 3 years ago, governor of Texas,
yes.
And we talked about our mutual love for the Eagle Scouts and both being distinguished Eagles.
Do you remember what you were doing December 7th, 1941?
Oh, I certainly do. You couldn't do a better job of asking the right questions. I was making a model airplane, a Swedish plane. I don't know. Don't ask me why a Swedish plane, but the Swedes were very good at, at automotive and aircraft, and I was making, out of paper and stuff they give you to put together a model airplane. And I remember John Daly, the announcer, the radio announcer in New York, we interrupt this program to tell you that the Japanese have just bombed Pearl Harbor. And that was in Pittsburgh. It was 11 o'clock. It was 11 o'clock in the morning at that time. And I thought I wasn't hearing things. I was hearing things, but then of course the news started filtering in as to what happened. So I do remember that very vividly.
And well, you were probably up on current affairs
Very
more
much
so
so.
than most people,
I was,
because you were right in the middle of it
yes.
to begin with. But could you see something in the Far East? Did you know anything about the Far East, Japan, and what might be happening out there?
Interestingly, I was a fanatic about keeping up with current events at that particular time. As a matter of fact, after the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, I began to realize that the war was either going to be won or lost, based on what I knew about Russian fighting spirit and the fact that a lot of people hadn't realized that Stalin, even though he murdered millions of his own people, he had industrialized Russia far more than people thought, and had moved a lot of factories back of the Ural Mountains, so that they were ready to, in the early stages, he fumbled and stumbled and it looked like they were going to collapse within 6 weeks. Well, things changed. A lot of people attribute it to the winter. The winter was a supporting factor, but when you get cold, whether you're a Russian or a German, the thing was that this gets into the military aspect. the Zhukov, who was Marshal Zhukov, who was really one of the greatest generals of the Second War, barring nobody else, had fought the Japanese in 1939 on the border of Manchuria and Siberia, and had given them a real bad licking. And the greatest hero of the Second War is somebody that nobody ever heard of, a man by the name of Richard Zorge, S-O-R-G-E, which is a German word for bad luck, and which he later was the object of. Richard Zorge was a communist who, of course, a lot of the communists went over to the Nazis, and he was a correspondent for the largest newspaper in Berlin, and they sent him to Tokyo to be the correspondent for this paper. And while he was there, he, through his activities, because he worked with the Russian Secret Service, and found out that the Germans were going to invade the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. He found this out as early as January, and he sent this information to Stalin through the diplomatic pouch of the Russian embassy. And Stalin thought this, he ignored it because he thought, well, you know, they got a treaty with Germany. He was stupid enough to believe in that treaty. And secondly, he thought this was British propaganda in order to involve him and get the pressure off of them. So they ignored it. But then Richard Zorge was not caught at that time. And when in 1941, early on, he found out the Japanese were going to invade the Dutch East Indies, Hong Kong, and then go as far as they could, because Roosevelt had told the Japanese if they must get out of Indochina, and until they do, he was going to cut them off from scrap iron and oil. So he was really provoking a war with the Japanese. I mean, not making a comment here one way or the other, but that's what happened. And that was fairly well known. At least I knew it as a kid. It was only going to be a matter of time. And he also, in a sense, provoked the war with Germany, because we sent troops into Northern Ireland and we took over Greenland, and you know, there were things. You got to give the man credit. He really got what he wanted, and he didn't care how he did it to get there. He believed it was up to him to save the Western world, and he did a pretty good job of it. But the interesting thing is, yeah, I watched every move that was being made. I had these big wall maps in my bedroom, and that was one of the ways I entertained myself.
Let me ask you about this. When you were in Germany, when you went to the movies, did they have any Western movies, any American movies over there?
Great question. First of all, I was the only one in the family that could go to the movies because I was an Aryan. Yes, Tom Mix was our favorite. Oh God, we loved Tom Mix. Oh yeah, I saw a bunch of two things we loved: Western movies and Shirley Temple.
Good Chip Lollipop.
Yeah, yeah. The one that we always liked, the Littlest Rebel.
Yes.
Yeah,
in the Civil War.
You know, we all thought the war between North and South. You know what we thought it was between North America and South America.
Bojangles was in that.
Yeah, Bojangles Robinson. That's right.
So, and were they? Did they have subtitles, or had they dubbed in?
No. They
German?
had dubbed in. Yeah, I remember what the one song she was singing when she was in the orphanage. Animal crackers in my soup.
Oh, right.
And in Germany they had it all different, but they had some little German girl, you know, giving a translation.
Yeah. So did you go to the movies a lot?
Oh yeah.
In the States
yes.
too? I mean, when you got here.
Yes, that was part of my education process.
I mean, well, let's go back to Taylorville. What's the name of the town?
Taylorville.
And
yes.
did you live right in town or outside the town?
Oh no, there was no outside. If you blinked hard, you might miss that town.
Do you remember the street you lived on?
Yes, 602 East Poplar Street.
Okay. And what did your kids do for fun? Well, this time you were like 12, 13, something like that.
No,
Or you were
when we got to Taylorville, let's see, I was 13.
13. Okay.
And I loved baseball. played a lot of baseball, and we had a beautiful park called Manners Park, and we had a big baseball field, and they used to play semi-pro baseball games out there, and a bunch of us used to play there. And God, I just liked to hit. I didn't like the field. I wish I could have just hit. I wanted to be a designated hitter, not a fielder. And also, I was a great runner, very fast.
Yeah.
And I had a great fantasy dream that I was going to go to the Olympics, because I was running the 100-yard dash as a 10-second man when I was 14 years old.
Oh, that's very good. I was kind of going back to those Berlin Olympics. Are you familiar with a guy named Louis Zamperini?
Heard the name.
Okay. He's from Torrance, California.
Yes,
Kind of like
yes.
you when you were growing. He got in trouble all the time, and so the cops were chasing him. And one cop grabbed me and said, "You really run so fast." I said, "You need to get into a track program," and so he did, and kind of turned his life around and went representing the United States in the 1936 Olympics over there in Berlin. Well, one of the things he did. He was still incorrigible, I guess. He climbed up a flagpole and was pulling down a Nazi flag.
Oh, yes. Now I know where I know that name. Zamperini,
yeah,
that's
Zamperini.
right.
And
Sure.
so then later on, he was, their plane went down in the Pacific, and he was a POW of the Japanese and got cruelly mistreated and everything. And I have a DVD of the story, and where I got it, when they had the Olympics in Nagano, the Winter Olympics several years ago
Sure.
in Nagano, they had, because he ended up there. That's when he was the last place that he was a POW of. And so they had him carry the flag in. This time he's in his late 80s or 90s, and he carried the Olympic torch into the stadium afterwards. Well, they had on right before the last day, I was watching it on TV, and CBS had this, and they were just starting out, and I just popped in a VHS tape. I thought this is going to be kind of interesting, because they told a little bit about what it was about, and taped it, and so then I made a DVD, and we have it here, and it was really quite interesting.
When did he die?
He's still alive.
You're kidding.
Yep.
What?
He's in his 90s, yeah.
I'll be darned.
Yeah.
Isn't
And
that
part of it, they showed, you remember Ralph Edwards and This Is Your Life?
Of course.
Well, they showed a little clip of that because they had him on that. So.
You know, my wife always kids me about this. This is your life. She says, probably what you would call your troop leader from Germany to, oh, so glad to see you.
So, do you remember? So, did you go to? You were in grade school, I guess.
Yes, I was still in grade school. Right, I
Okay.
was in the 8th grade.
Oh, in 8th grade, and then you went into high school there, and you played baseball.
I played baseball. I wasn't very good at baseball. I didn't realize at the time I had an astigmatism, and I couldn't hit a curveball. But when I got a hold of one, I went a mile.
Did you have any favorite teams?
I was a fanatic. Oh, sure. Well, sports was everything. Actually, in college, I became the sports editor of the Daily Line at the University of Illinois for 2 years, which was the year that Illinois won 10 Big Ten championships, which has never been equaled by any other Big Ten team. So, yeah, sure. I mean, my big sport in high school was track. I made a huge mistake. My sophomore year, I just missed going to the state meet in a quarter mile. My coach wanted, you're very fast, but your best bet, and you also have the ability to, breathe properly. So you have the stamina. So the best bet is to be the quarter mile. And I was running a quarter mile at 51, 52 seconds. And then I made the mistake because the football coach wanted me. And I played a couple of games and I got hurt. And I hurt my knee. And that was the end of my track career. See, and you know why I went off of football? Because how many girls came to see a track meet?
I was say.
Do I have to say more?
No cheerleaders at the track.
That's right, exactly.
Did you have a special girlfriend in high school?
No, I didn't. And that's an interesting question. I always liked girls. I mean, I was even as a little kid in Germany. In fact, my first love was when I was 6 and 7 years old with the daughter of a German army officer. So at least I made good choices. I even remember her name, Elizabeth Krauss.
Oh.
She after the war they emigrated to South Africa.
Oh. You were Glenn Cunningham?
Oh sure, great.
He
mother.
was running about the time you were, I think, I think he was from Kansas, wasn't he? Cunningham.
Oh yeah, he was. Actually, Bannister was the one that broke the 4 million
Right.
mile record.
Yeah, that was later. Do you remember any of your favorite teachers in high school?
Yes, I do. I'll tell you this: my high school only had 600 people in it, and my graduating class was about 120, 125. About a third of them are no longer with us. Because it's funny. There's a guy out here by the name of Jack Spinner who found out about me by reading in the paper and so on, and wanted to know if I was the guy that was at Taylorville. And he was a good athlete, so we get together once a month, talk about the old times.
Yeah.
So the teachers, great teachers. I had a great teacher in physics, great teacher in chemistry. Had two wonderful women teachers in English. And I think I really started blossoming when I was in high school. And the interesting thing was when I graduated from high school, I won the county scholarship. And that's the way I got to the University of Illinois. My father could afford it. But the point was, the veterans were coming back in droves even as late as 47, and they had no openings. Only a handful of openings for those who weren't in the service. But when you had a scholarship, you automatically got in. And I remember I joined a fraternity, and most of the kids there were from Chicago, and they had a proficiency test for rhetoric. If you weren't up to snuff for English rhetoric standards, they put you in Red 0, like a remedial course. If you were okay, they put you into Red 1, but if you were superior, you were in Red 2, and I was very pleased to be in Red 2, where all these Chicago kids were in Red 0, because the public school system in Chicago was rotten compared to the great education and kids from there will say it gladly. And even in those days, my wife said, she didn't get half the education that I did in grade school, in high school.
Yeah. So what year did you start Illinois then?
I started Illinois in 1947.
Now your brother, was he old enough to get into the service during World War II?
Yeah, he was dying to get in the service. I mean, he was drafted, but he and another guy volunteered, and they got in right at the end of the war. My brother was born in 1927, and he went through basic, and then he was sent to Germany because obviously he spoke fluent German. He was also a fabulous radio personality. He could speak perfect English, with tremendous articulation and so on, which I certainly couldn't at the time. And so he was made an announcer for the Armed Forces Network out of Bremerhaven. Oh. And he had everything going for me. But he was 18 years old, and he had a driver, a corporal who drove him around. He had all the benefits, and he had all the ladies. Now, imagine these German women back in, this was in 1945, 46. He had his pick.
Yeah.
But he went to Illinois College in Jacksonville, Illinois. He didn't. I would have wound up at Millikan University in Decatur because I didn't want to go to a big university, and Millikan was in Decatur. It wasn't nice. It was it was a liberal arts school. Would prepare you for another
Catholic school, I think.
I don't know.
I'm not sure.
It could very well be, but I love those people there. I went up there. They said we were very happy to have you as a student. But when I got the scholarship, my mother said, "There's no way you're going to go anywhere but Illinois." I mean, because that puts you in a privileged position.
I wanted to back up just a little bit. when you were talking about going to the synagogue and stuff like that, did you make your bar mitzvah?
Yes, but that was done in the United States.
Oh, it was. Oh,
Yes, that was, I was bar mitzvah at a temple, the name was Tree of Life on Boulevard of the Allies in Pittsburgh.
well, in Pittsburgh you did.
Yeah, by a very famous rabbi by the name of Halperin. And in fact, the Rabbi Zions out here, who they have their basic congregation at the Episcopalian Church on Route 74. They've had a great relationship there, and he remembered that rabbi very well.
So are you active in the Jewish faith now?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that. I am a dyed-in-the-wool Zionist conservative, and to me, I'm afraid that most of the Jews, at least until recently, were dyed-in-the-wool Democrats. My way of solving that problem is not to get involved in an argument or discussion. My reputation, it may make me a person of strong convictions, even somebody that's very polarizing. I don't know if you ever heard me on the radio or, well, I think you probably know enough about me to know what I'm talking about. And the way I handle the problem is not to get into an argument. And also, another way of handling the problem is the fact that I have established myself as an economic expert, both in writing and speeches and everywhere I can do it. And my basic statement about that is, if you talk politics, 5% is fact and 95% is BS. Whereas in economics, you better have 95% facts, and you know, about 5% BS is okay too. So, and that's why Steve Kelly and I get along just perfectly, because we spend all our time, and he's such a brilliant guy, and he has all the background. We can talk about the Eurozone, we can talk about kick the can down the road, you know, all those economic things that make things happen.
I'm sure you persuade people more so by your writings and this, for people to have time to digest it and learn about it, stuff like that. If you're arguing with somebody for 30 minutes, you're not going to make a difference.
Do you know what my favorite time of the week is, David? I have we call it a discussion group. It's at the Desert Willow, and it's every Tuesday from 11:30 to 2. They call it Tuesdays with Morrie just by coincidence. In fact, I had a little show on KMIR, which I don't do anymore. It's called Tuesday with Morrie, where I, gave my opinion on things. And it's limited, and I make it very plain. If you are not a conservative, I don't care if your party affiliation is not as important as conviction. And since I'm very, very strong in my, I'd say almost arch conservative convictions, that if a person does not have those kind of convictions or close to them, they're going to be uncomfortable. I says, why make two people uncomfortable? You're going to make me uncomfortable, and you're going to make you uncomfortable, because I've been doing this now since 1995. First, I just did it in the wintertime when the snowbirds were here, but by popular demand, I've made it year-round. Sometimes I have to be out of town, but I have another guy that's with me who's very good. And like yesterday, we had the meeting, Tuesday, and we had about 50 people. In this transitional time, in the wintertime, it really gets crazy. I mean, we have as many as 100 people come in. And much of it is I select the agenda, and I give the background, and then people can participate, but they have to raise their hand and be recognized by a guy who's got a microphone like Phil Donahue used to have, and he goes around and they get 3 minutes to talk. So I keep it very disciplined and very organized.
Yeah.
But this is great for me because it gives me a real outlet to get into the political arena, which I do not get into when, other than I must say, if you have a chance to watch that TV show, it's on 14 times during the week on channel 111. Do you have a Time Warner box?
I do, yes.
Yeah, it's on, let's see, today's Wednesday. It's on today. Today it's on channel 17, but on Time Warner it's on 120 simultaneous with, because they give me 3 nights a week on a public outlet, so
Okay.
that people that don't have the box can see
Yeah.
it.
I've got a DVR too, so I can tape it. And
Oh,
watch
great.
It.
Yeah, it's on demand on
Yeah.
110.
I put together a. We've done about 670 of these interviews so far, and I put together about 30 of them and edited them down, added music and pictures and things
that's
like that.
gotta be-
Mainly World War II guys, but some Korea and Vietnam too. And they were real interested in it, and so I took them down there, showed it to them. We were going to put it in an on-demand thing, and had it all set up. And then for some reason, the lawyers couldn't get together to, as far as liability or whatever, you know. That.
Well,
and
the
so-
lawyers know how to say no.
I know, and so we never did. In the meantime, I put them on YouTube, so they're available that people can go
Oh,
there
that's
and watch
great.
them. I'll show you some of that
Sure.
stuff and give you where you can go take a look at some of them. Okay, let's go back to Illinois now. What fraternity did you belong to?
Tau Delta Phi, national fraternity. I know the chapter Pi chapter in Illinois is no longer in existence.
Oh,
They
yeah.
merged with another one.
Okay, and the Fighting Illini. What kind of teams, football teams, did they have in those days when you were
Well,
there?
I was lucky. The year I became sports editor, Illinois was a national champion. 1951, 1952. I got to know those guys. We had a reunion 50 years later, and they asked me to get it organized. So I maintained my relationship. Johnny Karras was one of the great
Right.
players on that team,
Yeah,
and
yeah, I remember
Tommy
that.
O'Connell was the quarterback.
Yeah.
We had
Who was the coach?
Ray Elliott.
You're
Ray
right.
Elliott was the
Uh-huh.
coach.
And yeah, his brother was at Michigan, I think, or Minnesota.
No. You're thinking of another Elliott.
Bum Elliott.
There were two, Pete Elliott and Chalmers Bumps Elliott.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
That's right, Pete.
that was Elliott with one L. This
Oh.
one was Elliott with
Oh,
two.
okay, I got you.
Ray Elliott actually succeeded Bob Zupke
Mhm.
in the early 40s,
Yeah.
and he was a little bit of a controversial coach, but he and I developed a great relationship.
So, and what was your major?
My major was, well, I started off in liberal arts, then I went into College of Commerce, and then went from there to the Communication College.
Okay.
And I have had a very, very strong relationship. In fact, 4 years ago, they were going to liquidate that college because they only had it as a 2-year college for almost 80 years since its founding. And the associate dean came to me, that was a lady, Nancy Casey, and she said, I can't get Dennis Swanson, who was chairman of the alumni and very famous radio personality. He was the guy that found Oprah Winfrey, gave her her first start. All these guys, and Hal Bruno and Balt, I forgot his first name. They're all too busy. They say, it'll work itself out. Well, me, I'm still a little kid who wants to get involved. I got in there. I had made all the things I liked when I was a kid. I now have in droves. I made a lot of connections, a lot of contacts, and I knew out of the 7 trustees at the university, I knew 5 of them personally. So I did a lot of politicking. Sum and substance was that not only were we able to maintain the college, I got the guy that I wanted, a former correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. He became the dean. That was all part of the deal. And we made it it's now a 4-year school for the first time in the last 4 years. And for that, I got the only distinguished alumni award that college ever gave out. Now, the obvious question is, how come they never gave it out? They had such famous people like Scotty Reston, Roger Simon, they had more famous people coming out of that little school than any other college because, it's communication, media. The reason they gave it to me was for the gratitude of what I achieved for them, but also they never wanted to get that out because there were too many egos. You give it to one guy, and they're going to be very, you know, you do it in the engineering college, who cares, right? You're a distinguished alumni. But wait a second, you mean to tell me he's more important than I am? You know, people in the media are, and I don't think that comes as a surprise, are the biggest egotists that ever lived.
Did you live on campus?
Yes.
Champaign-Urbana, I guess.
Yes.
Tell me, Champaign, is that two towns are right together? How does that name come about?
Yeah, it's the original town was Urbana. It's a smaller one. Champaign is where most of it's separated by Wright Street, which carves the college in two. You know, Illinois was a land-grant college. It was founded, I think it was like during the Civil War, and it was primarily an agricultural college, and it really got to be known for that, and then sprouted forward from there.
How far from Chicago is it?
Taylorville was 215 miles. It's about 160 miles from Chicago.
West?
No, due south.
Due south. Oh.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, the Illinois Central actually goes right there. The people that come for the weekend or people that live in Chicago, go home and come back, used to take the Illinois Central. It was very convenient.
Did you live at the fraternity house?
Yes.
And were you in ROTC?
Oh, yeah. Yes. That's almost a superfluous question. I was a cadet commander. Yes, and I was also a scabbard and blade.
What's that?
That's the fraternity, ROTC fraternity.
Oh, okay.
They have two, scabbard and blade, and some other one.
What branch of the service was that ROTC?
That's a good question. I think they had quartermaster.
No. What was it? Army or
Oh,
Air
Army.
Force? Oh, it was
Army.
Okay.
Yeah. The Navy came up with this Navy ROTC, but last year in high school, and I took the test and I passed the test easily, and then I went for the physical test and I passed that, and then the next thing I know, I had to pass the commandant, the commander of Navy. No, he was actually a captain, and in Chicago. Are you familiar with Chicago? They had the Navy had a headquarters down on Plymouth Court in Chicago. And I remember he came in and he said, so I'm looking at your file here. You weren't born in the United States. I said, well, of course I wasn't. I don't make any secret of it. He said, well, you're not eligible. Didn't anybody tell you? Oh, I was absolutely crestfallen. As it turned out, I'm glad. Everything in my life that's happened, I'm glad it happened. I can say that without any qualification.
Okay, I got to change tape now. How you doing, Morrie?
Doing fine.
Yeah,
You mean all this has been taped?
No, we don't edit. We don't want to miss anything that you say.
You know, I got to tell you, you are one of the greatest interlocutors. Questions almost seem like you've given me a free pass to tell my story.
Well, that's the whole idea, and it's. Well, let me see if I'll have him go down and get some water for us.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, Bob's here, so he's going to go down and get some. Well, it's always been interesting to me.
But there are so many facets to my background, and you sort of, well, that's because you know a lot of these things, so
Yeah.
Your knowledgeability makes it much easier for me to be able to be responsive.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about ROTC on campus there at Illinois, then.
Oh, we had a, we had a great, Illinois was one of the great ROTC colleges, and it, of course, with my natural proclivity toward the military, I jumped at that right away. I knew that once you got out of it, and this was obviously before the Korean situation developed, which was 1950.
I should back up a little bit. Could you see something coming like that in Korea at the time?
No, because Dean Acheson had made a speech 90 days before the North Koreans and with Stalin behind them attacked, where he said that Korea was no longer part of the security periphery of the United States. That was a very stupid, provocative statement, frankly. But no, we didn't expect it. As a matter of fact, when it happened, it was, I think it was like June 25th, 1950. We were going through an officer's preparation at Fort Lee, Virginia, and we were having a good time at Virginia Beach, and we were wallowing in the sand, having a good time, and the radio.
Was this your freshman or sophomore?
No, that would have been 1950. Would have been my junior year.
Your junior year, okay.
In college, and we thought they were going to take us from there, right? Because everything was in a state of flux at that time, and we were going through this training program. And I remember, we had a bivouac at AP Hill, and actually I remember that that time very, very fondly. But the thing I remember the most was from ROTC, the colonel who was in charge of the program saw in me somebody who was very much into the military stuff, and he took me under his wing, and I really, really liked the idea of commanding troops.
Yeah. At AP Hill, as I recall, was a Southern general.
Yes, he was.
Wore a red. I think he always wore a red shirt or something when he went into battle.
All I remember is that's where we bivouacked, and was a terrible place.
It's interesting how our country, you're talking about the Civil War, I mean, a lot of our military bases and things have Confederate names, general names.
The natural militancy of the United States came from the Southeast. I mean, that's why they put up such a big battle, a successful battle, because they never had a chance. I mean, against the numbers and the industrialization of the North. And the whole thing was an economic war to begin with. It was not a war to free the slaves. That was the convenience for Lincoln to do what he had to do.
Right.
But the people in New England were furious about the fact that the Southerners could make the same thing. It was like making stuff overseas now. Their cost was zero, labor cost. They couldn't compete. So that's a little side issue.
Right. Okay, so you're down there now. Did you go into ROTC your freshman year, or right away?
No, that's interesting. I think when I was a sophomore.
So by the time you're a junior, you're kind of a company commander or something? Did you say? Okay.
Yeah.
And did you like that, leading men more or less?
Oh, absolutely. I enjoyed that, and we used to have the parades, and we have the basic presentations and so on, and with the colonel there. Yeah. And God, I just felt at home.
I should ask you, when you were down in Southern Illinois, did you go hunting a lot and fishing and stuff like that?
Interestingly, no. Turned out my wife's a great fisherwoman, but I was not big on the hunting thing. I think part of it, I was so engrossed in current events, and in track, and as a kid, my father wasn't a hunter either, so.
Well, I guess when you were in ROTC, did you have rifle practice or
yeah,
stuff like that?
Absolutely.
Did you like that?
Very. Hey, Bob, how you doing, buddy?
Good, Morrie.
Hey, you're the promoter of this.
There's still a little bit of mold in there, but don't want to bother you, okay?
That's okay.
Good seeing you.
The mold will die when it gets into my stomach. Thanks, Bob.
There you go. Yeah.
Thank you, Bob.
No, funny, my wife Ruth is a accomplished horsewoman, which she gave up. She got a bad back and so on.
Yeah.
But for years and years, she was with the Desert Riders and very active
Oh,
in that
yeah.
group. She's very active in the community too.
Frank Bogert knows.
Oh yeah, he initiated her,
Uh-huh.
she was chairman of the Bump and Grind Trail Committee,
Oh, yeah.
and she was also on the board of the Children's Discovery Museum. She gives herself. She's not as outspoken as I am. Like she says, you can't have two in the same family.
Yeah, I interviewed Frank a couple of years ago. Before he died. He was in the Navy he was on a battleship in the Pacific during World War II. Bogert, Frank
Yeah,
Bogert
well,
was-
he died shortly thereafter.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. About a year.
He was a character.
He was. He really was. Yeah. Spoke his mind too. Okay, so Korea comes along, and so then what?
What happened then? We thought we were going to. No, they, let us go back to our college work, and then I had to put in an extra year because
You want some more?
No, I'm fine. I had been in the College of Commerce, but I wanted to spend 2 years to get my degree in communications. And I wanted a minor in economics. So I actually wound up spending 5 years. I graduated in 1952. But in order, that was already during the Korean War, or police action as they call it. So the colonel said, I'll tell you what, I can get you an exemption for when. I said, I don't want an exemption, I'm going to go in. I want to go in. But he said, well, an exemption defers you. But you have the ability to communicate, and I don't know if you've ever taught anything. I said, well, I've been involved in little groups. He said, no, I mean, have you ever been a teacher? I said, no, I haven't. He said, would you like to teach? I said, what military courses? I said, boy, my eyes lit up. I sure would. He says, but this will require you spending 4 to 6 weeks at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York. I says, you're making this out to be a difficulty? Are you kidding? Send me to... So I went up there. And my first experience was in the Great Hall. Have you been up?
Yeah, but only through the museum and stuff. You know.
Well, in the Great Hall there was a bust of a man, and it looked like a Roman. And I came to it was Judah Maccabee, father of he was the first commando. He was the father of unconventional warfare. And he had never had more than 8,000 people under his command fighting against the Syrians, the Greeks, who had 250,000 troops and elephants and chariots and everything. He was like Stonewall Jackson. He knew how to hit them at the right time, at the right place. So that's how he got his reputation. And he became sort of like a patron saint for me.
Yeah.
Because I studied this guy from the beginning and end.
The Book of Maccabees and the Bible
Yeah.
and stuff.
Well, the thing is, it's it's interesting. Are you Catholic?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that the Apocryphy is in the Protestant Bible or the King James Bible. They stop with Ezekiel, Nehemiah coming back from Babylon. That's the end of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, and then it starts off with the New Testament.
Yeah.
But there is a gap in there. In the Catholic version, there is an Apocrypha which covers this period.
Yeah.
And this is, and a lot of people don't know that Protestants don't know about Judah Maccabee, but in the Catholic religion,
Yeah, we know all about it.
it is. And this man was a great man. I mean, he was the forerunner of the Israel Defense Forces. A lot of people wonder how come Jews became such great soldiers suddenly. Usually people have a proclivity. There are ethnic proclivities, and these aren't supposed. They're supposed to be great musicians and artists, and so on. Suddenly they become guys I know in the military that have dealt with the Israeli pilots and others. They're the best in the world. And I said, this is a throwback. But a lot of them over the years also distinguished themselves. You know, Uriah P. Levy was the head of the Northern Navy, the Federal Navy during the Civil War, and there were some. The guy who was head of the Anzacs during the First War was a Jew. You know, but at that time, if they were good guys, they were known as Australians or American. If they were a bunch of thieves, they were known as Jews. I mean, this is unfortunate the way that's the way history is. But anyway, after that, I came back and I taught military courses for a year while I was going to my last year at the College of Communications.
Oh, okay, yeah. And you...
I really enjoyed that.
You'd say you... were you the editor of the...
I was the sports editor of the Daily Liner, yes.
Okay.
Also became a house president, but I gave that up. I couldn't do both at the same time. I think my junior year, I suddenly got out of my brother's domination. He didn't do it deliberately, but my folks always believed he was the prince of the family, you know, primogeniture and all that stuff. And I was just a little tag-along kid. So I developed my own sense of confidence after that, and became very active. Became president of Sigma Delta Chi, which is a journalist fraternity, also professional journalistic fraternity. And I think becoming sports editor of the University of Illinois Daily gave me a tremendous amount of confidence. I not only made me immediately a big man on campus, but it also gave me a chance to travel with the team. You know, they won the Rose Bowl that year, with Final Four, the basketball, and I went to Miami, and went to places I never had been to before. So it kind of opened up the world to me in a big way.
Did you have a special girl in college?
No, it's interesting. I had one special girl, but she was serious and I was not. I was smart enough to know that until I established myself, to suddenly get myself sidetracked, getting married and so on. Because in those days, you know, if you really liked somebody, eventually that was the obvious way to go.
You remember her name?
Yes, Beverly Beck.
Yeah. So you graduate, and then what?
Actually, then I went into a friend of mine was working as a lifeguard at a place up in the Catskills. So I spent 3 months there, had a great time, to say the least, and then went in the Army.
Did you see what do they call it, the Boris Bell or something, where the comedians and stuff?
Oh, sure.
Did you go see anybody?
Oh,
up
yeah,
there?
certainly. Yeah, one of them was the guy that played in Godfather. He played do you remember the guy that played the role? The Italian guy. He played the role of the guy who was supposed to be like Frank Sinatra.
Oh yeah, Al Martino.
Martino, wasn't it?
Yeah, Al Martino.
Al
Right.
Martino. He was
he's dead.
great. He was only about 18 years old at the time. He was a great singer. I mean, he was as good as Dean Martin or anybody else. And he was a nice person too. I got to know him. You know, we got to see all the shows we wanted to see. But we were pretty much locked in. We'd like to go to the other places, but they said no.
Was it a camp? Was it like you saw the movie Dirty Dancing?
Yeah,
You remember, it was
yeah.
kind of a camp like that for
Yeah,
not just kids,
Marjorie
for,
Morningstar. You know, yes, it was.
for adults. And,
You know, huh?
for adults and kids, or you were a lifeguard at this?
I was a lifeguard. We were in charge of the pool and,
Right.
and so on. And a guy, a college kid from one of the Eastern colleges, was my co-lifeguard. I learned something about life while I was there at the 3 months, and I learned something about New Yorkers and New England that I knew I was never made to live in that part of the country. I was destined to become a Midwesterner.
So then, what after that? After
Then I went in the Army, and my my first shot was at Fort Lee, where I went through the officer's course.
And were you a second lieutenant then when you went in?
Yes, I was the second lieutenant.
Okay.
And on the way from the Catskills up in New York, which Liberty, New York, right north of New York City, I stopped at the Pentagon. I was one of these guys who had no fear of doing things like that. And there was, I wanted to know where this psychological warfare headquarters were, because I knew about that was where, if you're interested in journalism and propaganda and so on, that was a place you might want to look at. And I walked in, and there was a major was in charge, and he was available, because I had not much to do that day. Had to put in. So we got to talking, and he said, "Listen, I'll tell you what you do. Why don't you?" This was on my way to Fort Lee. Why don't you write a letter and tell us your background? And again, I was like, that time I wrote that letter from my father, this ain't going to go anywhere. So what happened was, after we finished our preparatory 90 days before we were put on some active assignment, I was the only one out of that whole group that was directed to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where the Psychological War Division headquarters were. So I got there, and I went through, they had another training program for another about 120 days. And by that time I was good at writing letters, and I was telling my buddies that I wanted to go to Fort Slocum, which is right off the coast of Westchester County. It's the Armed Forces Information School. Impossible to get into. They primarily used it for R&R for people coming back from Korea, or, it was a real plum to be that close to New York, and it was really a great watering spot, to say the least. And they said, "You're crazy, you don't have a chance to go in there." So I sent a letter, and I was notified that I was going to be going next to Fort Slocum for another 90 to 120 day program. And then I learned that if you were one of the 3 graduates, you could almost pick your next spot. So when I got there, I got to New York and saw a place, but I always stayed up with my studies and so on. I was number 3 in the class, and I was then assigned to the office, they called it at that time the Office of the Chief of Army Field Forces, that became the Continental Army Command. And I got there, and a few days I went into see General Dahlquist. I'm sure the name, that goes back to the middle 50s. He was the general in charge of the Continental Army Command, which was known as OCAF at the time. And we stayed at a very nice, lovely bachelor officer quarters right by the Newport News. Real nice, very plush, especially for a kid, 22 years old. And anyway, so I got to know him very, very well, and he liked me. And he says, "As long as you're here, I'm going to make you my adjutant or assistant." I said, "What are the responsibilities?" He says, "Well, probably more in the communications arena." So I, happy to do that. Well, he said, "By the way, aren't you from that psychological warfare group down in Fort Bragg?" He says, "Yes, I've got some very important documents I've got to send down there. So you'll be my courier." And he one of those bucket seat planes. He said, "We'll fly you over there, and you'll have this attached to your arm." They had a little chain with a little valise attached to it. And I landed at the Pope Air Base at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and the general, 1-star, who was commanding the Psychological Warfare Center, sent his chauffeur out to greet this courier to bring him in. He didn't know who it was. So I'll never forget, I get off the plane, and this chauffeur said, "Lieutenant Beschloss, what are you doing here?" He said, "You're the guy." So wait till General Signal sees you. And I went in there, and he says, "Beschloss, I've got to tell you something. I'm a West Point graduate. I've been out of there now for about 25 years, but in all my years in the service and the war and everything else, I have never met anybody who's made the Army the personal vehicle to his good times. I says, General, I'm a victim of circumstance. He says, you're going to come back here. And the last, I think I had then had about a year left. At that time, you're going to see, we're going to get you to really do some real work here in this man's Army. And you know what that real work was? Actually, I did finally get back. And when I got back, they were going to have a maneuver down in Louisiana, the blue and the red and the blue, and they wanted a propaganda campaign that would be a way for our troops to be enculturated into what they might meet when they got over there. And at that time, we had some problems with some people deserting and going over to the North Koreans. So I came up, I developed a plan, and one of them was a major leaflet, 2 sides to it. On the one side, it had a guy in a foxhole with shells bursting over his head, obviously under fire, and it said, "Your night maneuver." This was made for the maneuver. And on the other side, they had a beautiful girl with a short skirt and her legs crossed sitting on a bar stool, talking to some gigolo, and underneath it said, "Her night maneuver." Now the big problem for me was she had a wedding band on. And then, of course, I was a big publicity hound, so we got the New York Times had a 4-page spread on this propaganda thing, and also the Army, Navy, Air Force Times had it. Next thing I know, never forget this, there's a Lieutenant General Paul Adams in the Pentagon, who, by the way, retired here, and I never even knew that. But anyway, he told General Cleland, who was commanding Fort Bragg, that I want you to get the bottom of this, and I want to get ahead here. I mean, someone's going to have to pay for this embarrassment to the Army. So guess what? The general gave it to the colonel, and the colonel gave it, and Zippo, next thing I know is General Cleland wants to see you in his offices. And I was scared to death. I figured the last thing I need is a court-martial, even if I was exonerated. You know, it's on your record.
Yeah.
Wherever you go, and I had no business experience at that point. So I came in, and I saw Cleland for the first time, and everybody hated the guy because he used to make these reservists get up at 5 in the morning and do calisthenics. He was a real gung-ho sort of guy. And he said, "What are you here for?" I says, "This has to do with this propaganda thing." He said, "Are you the guy?" I said, "Well, sir, there's a long story behind it." I didn't give him just a second. Oh, he said, "Well, tell me quickly. Why did you do this?" I said, "Well, sir, I was supposed to develop a basic prospective propaganda campaign that our boys would be faced with when they got over to Korea. And you know, they're getting very sophisticated. They're not saying anymore, prisoners of the world, you know, throw off your chains, that old Marxist stuff. They're now being very clever. And I thought this would be very good." He said, "Just a second, there's a phone call from General Adams." I'll never forget. He says, "Paul, how are you?" He says, and you know, no smile on his face. He says, "How's your golf game? How about me? Can we make a date next month to play at Burning Tree?" You know, I was sitting there, I'm dying. You know, so finally he says, "Well, you know about this thing with a propaganda thing, and well, you know, our boys have to know what they are faced with over there." So he put the phone down, and he looked at me very sternly. He says, "You heard the conversation, Lieutenant?" "Yes, sir, I did." He says, "Well, I got you off the hook this time, but you know, this is very serious. You better be careful in the future. Well, you're in this man's Army." That's exactly what he said. He says, "By the way," he said, "I understand you write for the Fayetteville Observer." I says, "Yes, sir. I wrote a weekly column called Cy-War Sidelines." And, you know, I was already doing this kind of thing at Illinois, so it was kind of natural. He says, have you ever been a drama critic? I said, well, yes, sir, I think I have. You know, that wasn't my first interest. I never was a drama critic. He said, I know where he was leading to. He says, you know, Mrs. Cleland is head of the Fort Bragg Players. I said, sir, I'm very surprised, but I'm delighted to hear that. He said, how would you like to be a drama critic for the Fayetteville Observer? They've been asking for us to send somebody down there. And I said, yeah, I'd be delighted. And he says, now be objective. If you think it's amateurish, if not, say it. We want you to be honest. I said, does this guy think I'm crazy? Everything was Broadway material, for God's sake. Well, he and I got to be friends. And 6 months later, when I was ready to get out, he called me up and he said, I want you to re-up for another 4 years. He says, I badly need a public relations officer, and I know you're going to be a captain of reserve, but if you do this, within 3 months I'll have you a major, because I can't have anything less than major being my public relations officer. And my survey, there's a time involved. No, I can do it. I promise you this. And I said, well, think it over. I came back and I said, listen, I really am honored and appreciative of this, but I think it's time to go on. I mean, by that time I was 25 years old, and I wanted to experience a new adventure in my life. Well, he said, I want you to know, I really appreciate you. I've learned a lot about you, and good luck to you. And, well, when I got my 201 file, it was almost beautiful. I put that on my list as a commendation. He gave me a fabulous commendation. And then when I got back in the reserves, I came back to Fort Bragg to do a 2-week stint in the reserves. When I came in, I'll never forget, at the desk of the officers club, the lady was still the same one. It wasn't that many years. She says, Colonel Beschloss. So, she thought I was a colonel because he had made such a big deal about me to the people at Fort Bragg. By the way, because of my Illinois background, that's how I met my wife. But this is very, very unusual. She was a freshman when I was in my last year in college. She knew all about me because I was a sports editor, and she was a sports nut. And she had 2 sisters who were girly girls. She was the only one that her father, who really wasn't fond of women, to say the least, he even had a male secretary. And she was the son that he never had. So she went him he had a box at the Wrigley Field to see the football. She loved football most of all. And he took her to a place where they boxing, Marigold Gardens in Chicago, and she knew all about sports. That was so. She said, I liked you from afar, but I never had the guts to call you and say hello or something.
Well, where did you meet her, actually?
Well, the way we met, after I got out of the Army, there was an opening with the National Sporting Goods Association in Chicago, and I was going to have a interview, but a couple other things too. I wanted to be in the public relations end of it. And a college buddy of mine who had been in the Navy was a couple years ahead of me. He tells me that his wife and my wife's parents belonged to the same country club. And one day, the day that I was there, I was staying at the YMCA. I guess she saw my wife, and my wife came over and saw that she was wheeling her baby at the time. And so she told her husband. He says, I know why you're calling me. I called him and some other college buddies to get a free meal. He says, I know you. You want a free dinner, don't you? He says, yeah, that's true. But we were good friends. So he said, well, if you can get a date with this girl, bring her along, you can have a dinner. Otherwise, forget it. He was give me the challenge. So I get on the phone. I call it. She doesn't know me from Adam, for God's sake. And I said, he calls somebody cold. This is Morrie Beschloss. He says, wait a second. Will you repeat that name, please? Morrie Beschloss. Says, you're the sports editor for the Daily Line. I got a question to ask you. I mean, just like, what's the question? You used to be when the announcer, the Illinois announcer who traveled with the team, when at halftime he would always interview you to get some comments about how the team was doing in the first half. And he said, I remember when we were playing the Washington Huskies, this is all her talking now, that he asked you, how come Illinois, which was the underdog in this dust-up, and he asked you, how come Illinois actually is a touchdown ahead? He said, well, Illinois got the best pass defense in the Big Ten, if not the whole country. He said, then how come, starting with the third quarter, Washington scored twice from scrimmage on passes? She had me eating out of her hand at that. I always tell that it's the longest conversation we ever had. I mean,
and what's her name and her maiden name?
Ruth Greenwald. Her father was a businessman. He had in the brass business. Real man's man.
What was her hometown?
Chicago. She was born and bred in Chicago. She went to Lemoyne grade school. She went to Senn High School. Then she went to Evanston High School for a while, and then she spent one semester at Illinois. See, the one semester was where she was aware of me. Then she went to Bennington College in Bennington, Vermont, very famous, one of the Seven Sisters. So it just was one of those fated incidents that was only possible by the fact that she had been at Illinois one semester and I had been a big shot at the college.
And when did you get married?
We got married on November 13th, just the other day. We've been married 57 years.
Oh, congratulations. So that would have been what year did you get married?
54.
1954. And do you have any children?
We have two fine sons. One of them has become a very distinguished presidential historian, and I say, this guy, he never met a president he didn't like. Every president has taken him into their inner circle. Actually, Nixon was already out of office, but he had a big interview with him in Vanity Fair. He started out, he also went to Williams College, and then he went to Harvard Business School. He got an MBA, and then got a position with the Smithsonian Institute. But at the same time, he also was picked up by CNN, which was just getting started at the time, as a kind of a part-time correspondent. He did a lot of work for them. He was in Russia. And he has published 9 books, 8 of them bestsellers. One of them, The Conquerors. There was 2 that he got right on top of the list. One of them called The Conquerors, about the end of the Second War, and the other one it was a Presidential Courage. The book was called. And so and the other one is a freelance writer.
And the first one, Michael, is that his name?
Michael, yeah.
Okay. And
he just got a book out right now. It just got on. It was the first 5 about Jacqueline Kennedy. You've been aware of that? It's both the book and the tapes that she had when Arthur Schlesinger interviewed her just a few months after Kennedy was assassinated. And he's buddy-buddy with Caroline Kennedy, so she asked him to put this book together.
And is his political outlook look the same as you?
Are you kidding? Is anybody's? No, I would say, I think he's very clever because he always says, I'm a historian, and a historian is supposed to be objective.
Yep.
In fact, Clinton asked him to write his official autobiography when he got out of office, and he said to Mr. President, I only do that after the president had been out of office for 20 years. He said, just imagine if I had written about Harry Truman when he got out of office with a 23% approval rating, as opposed to the way he's looked at now. And so Clinton said, okay, when I'm out of office 20 years, will you write my biography? He said, yes, if you and I are still around, we'd be happy to do it. And they've gotten to be very close friends.
Right.
He also got a little, not trouble, I mean, he got a little bad publicity in the last 6 weeks. Obama asked him to come along with his inner circle to Camp David to talk about the upcoming campaign. And he brought him along to give historical perspective. Of course, he said, you know, Harry Truman came out of nowhere and won. So Mark Levin, who was a radio announcer, got a hold of that, and boy, he really pasted him good. Of course, I feel the same way as Mark Levin, but he's my son, so I can't tell you that.
Does he have any children?
Yes, he's got 2 sons, and the older one is a fabulous athlete. He was named the #1 pitcher in the whole Washington, D.C. area. He goes to a private school, but he put him up against other pitchers. He's been clocked at 75 an hour with his fastball, and next year when he goes to college, he's already got offers. Scholarship offers. Oh, he needs that like he needs a home in his head.
And his wife, what is her name? Michael.
She's of Iranian background, and her name is Alsani, which is mean the flower of spring. She owns a hedge fund, which is now being bid on by Credit Suisse for money that you wouldn't even think about. I'm talking about lots of money.
And where do they live?
They live in Northwest Washington.
Okay. And your other son?
Stephen is a freelance writer. He lives in Scottsdale. He just wrote a book called about the problems the country is having from an economic standpoint. And he and the head of the National Science Foundation are very close, so they collaborated. And that book came out just about 2 months ago. Doing very well.
And does he have children?
Yeah, he's got 2 daughters. First time there have been any daughters in the Beschloss lineage, as far as we know, going all the way back to Sovietsky.
Oh, and what are their names?
The older one is Sarah, and the younger one is Katrina. And she was born just 2 years before the hurricane.
Oh, Katrina. And their mother?
She's a Finnish journalist.
Oh.
Isn't it interesting? They're all a bunch of foreigners in this family. And she's a journalist, and she writes for Finnish newspapers, and she's just written, I think she's written a book for the Finnish public. So she's a kind of global family.
And what is her name?
Her name is Kirsi Morrie, Kirsi. Kirsi Morrie is her middle name.
Pretty name, yeah.
Well, I got to tell you one thing that's also kind of relevant. Bob Novak, you know that name, don't you? Bob Novak had it in for me for 50 years. And you know why? When he wanted the sports editorship of the Atlantic at the same time I did.
Oh.
And he thought there was no chance I would get it because he was so much better. He was covering football. I covered gymnastics for 2 years because the gymnastic coach begged me. He says, you have brought our team so much renown, I need you for another year. And eventually they won the NCAA a few years later. But anyway, Novak just felt that I would played a dirty trick because I got to all the members of the Illini Publishing Board, and he never bothered with them. So he thought that was terrible, using those type. Well, why not? I mean, and the night we were together, he was kind of trying to make fun of me. He said, you know, I'll let you drown your tears. I'll buy you the beer afterwards. And I came in first. I was in there 5 minutes. And he said, Morrie, how you doing? Looking forward to having you on board for another year, and so on. You know, they did everything but tell me that I was chosen. And he came in and they grilled him for 45 minutes. And he thought that was a sign that he was getting it. Well, the next day, I mean, the guy bumped into me. I mean, he was looking for me, and he said, Beschloss. He used to call me my last name. He said, Beschloss, I don't, you know, you're not too smart enough to pull this kind of stunt. But anyway, don't ask me to be your assistant. Because usually the guy that lost would be the assistant. He says, I'm finished with this university, I'm finished. I'm going to go into professional writing. So finally, before he died about a year ago, he was, we were both by coincidence inducted into the Illini Media Hall of Fame. And he was being interviewed by Gary Stone on who's a good friend of mine. He's on K News, and he asked me if I would, if I mentioned that I would be on radio with him, would he mind if we talked for a few minutes? I said, it's okay with him. He says, yeah, I already asked him. He said he'd be happy to talk to you. He said, how you doing, Morrie? I said, okay, Novak. And he said, I understand we're both going to be at the Illini Media thing. Are you definitely going? I said, yeah, well, then I'll be there. Will you give me a few minutes? I said, sure. So we get there. He had converted from Judaism to Opus Dei Catholicism, which I'm sure you know is a little bit far out. Are you familiar with the Opus? Opus Dei was founded by a Spanish priest in 1928, and it's very, very radical, and it's got some very fanatical. I mean, I don't mean this to be disparaging. I mean, they're very committed priests that they're almost like the Mormons. I mean, they really go out and they go after people to convert them. And he got Novak, and he got Larry Kudlow from CNBC, and he got the guy Lerner, who had been running for governor. So he was very, very persuasive. And anyway, so I say that for the reason Novak said, well, Morrie, you probably wonder why I want to spend time with you. I said, well, after 50 years, I guess so. He said, the reason is that the Holy Spirit has advised me that I should forgive you for your sins that you committed in keeping me from getting the sports editorship. I said, well, I'll go along with the Holy Spirit if you change some of the crap you wrote about me in your last book, The Prince of Darkness. He had 5 pages devoted to me in his book, which had to do with his career in Washington, and he spent 5 pages talking about me. And the funny thing is that he gave me more publicity than anybody else could. One of the things he said when I met, by the way, he was very good to my son Michael. He really took him under his wing. He went out of his way to do it. And he said, you know, when I first met Michael, who's a great, brilliant historian, he said he reminded me a little bit of Beschloss at Illinois, except a hell of a lot smarter with a lot of talent. I mean, that was his way of digging. And then when he said, when I first started reading Beschloss's columns, as I expected, they were very pedestrian and very understandable, because he never stuck his neck out and never made a mistake. He was complimenting me. He didn't even realize it. And in his attempt to vilify me, he was complimenting me. So then he came out here at the library to give a book presentation. And again, he asked Gary Stone if I would be sitting in front. Before he started, he says, there were about 400 people there, and he said, I want to tell everybody what a wonderful guy Morrie Beschloss is. You know, he's one of the smartest guys I ever. I couldn't believe I was hearing this. He says, and you know, you're really privileged to have him in your community. The only thing I could figure out, and his wife, who wouldn't speak to me at Illinois when we were sitting at the table during the ceremony, being inducted, suddenly was all over me. He was selling books. If he goes out and says, Beschloss is a bum, you know, half the people would walk out, because there were a lot of my friends there. So anyway, that's the last I saw of him.
Okay, so you get married, and then what?
When I got a job with a Continental Insurance Company as a assistant advertising manager. From there, I floated a Situations Wanted ad in the Chicago Tribune and got a job as advertising manager for a big industrial company, Chicago Screw Company. And one of their clients was a tiny little company called Hammond Brass Works in Hammond, Indiana. And I got to know those, you know, they came over, and I said, you know, it's a little company, but I'd be more comfortable there than just being in this huge company that didn't even know what I was doing. I had 6 sales managers I reported to. None of those knew anything about advertising or PR. So I got a job with that company as assistant sales manager and advertising manager. and it was the company had just been acquired by a mini conglomerate in Connecticut, and the guy of the mini conglomerate was a member of the Young Presidents Organization. And I say that for what followed. When the owner died suddenly after in 1963, they had to replace him. He was a president. Nobody gave me a chance because I was 33 years old, and the director of manufacturing was in his early 50s, and the guy who was in charge of finance was maybe in his late 40s, and I was just a sales guy. Well, the president of the parent company picked me because I was getting all the business. I had doubled the business of the company since when I became full-time sales manager. And then from there on, they pushed me to get other acquisitions, which I did, and I built this into the second largest company in the valve industry in the whole country. Went from when I got in there, they were doing $2.5 million. When that company was taken over by Wheeler Dealer, they were doing $120 million, which was more than half of the total parent company. So I had a very successful career in that industry.
And how long were you with them?
Let's see, I joined on October 1st, 1956. I left in 1983. At the time when this Wheeler Dealer came in, he bought out my stock. I made sure that I got my stock out of there because the parent company had put a lot of money into robotics, industrial robotics, and they were competing with Westinghouse and GE. And you can't compete with those big companies. They didn't have that kind of money. And unfortunately, the chairman was so taken, he was taking the money I was making and throwing it into the robotics. Yes. So I got out of there, and my stock was bought out, and thank God, because otherwise it wouldn't have been worth anything. And the guy, the Wheeler Dealer, wanted me to go with him, and I said, listen, you freed the slaves, I'm not going to become a new one.
Now, were you doing any writing in the meantime?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I started a newsletter in 1980, which I'm still writing now for my industry. I also made speeches around the country, and I wrote ad hominem articles for trade publications.
Were you living in Hammond all this time?
No, I never lived in Hammond.
Oh.
We lived in South suburban Chicago, in Flossmoor.
You remember the street that you lived on, and what the house was like?
Yeah, we lived at 1800 Western Avenue. We bought a house. My wife always wanted to have a big house, so when I became president of the company, she thought that was to go with my status. I also became president of the Board of Education. I also was on the Chicago board of the Boy Scouts of America. So I always maintained my activity schedule.
Did you go to a lot of the sporting events in Chicago in those days?
Not a lot of them. I remember when the Bears played the Giants in 1963, and I froze my back off pretty good. Yeah. It was like 20 below zero that year. But no, I looked at sports like a business when I was writing about it. But I was never a good spectator in anything. I don't mean to make it sound like I'm disdaining spectators. I'm just not a good spectator. I like to be active. To this day, my wife goes to concerts, and she goes to McCollum. She belongs, and she's got a girlfriend. Her sister, her older sister, spends time out here, but I just don't go. I've got myself too busy in things that I can do that are active. I'm an activist rather than a pacifist.
Did you play golf or tennis or anything like that?
Yeah, I played golf until about 7 years ago. I had a 9 handicap golfer. Mm-hmm. But when I got very active out here in television and newspapers and giving speeches and so on, it was impinging on my time to the point where I had to make a choice. Yeah, so I quit cold turkey.
Yeah, I had to. When I got involved here at the Air Museum, I had to cut back on
well, I was going to say, that's
too,
exactly the same thing. Once
same thing. Yeah.
Once you displace what you've done for a living and what you've been committed to, I feel blessed, and I'm sure you do too, to have something now that this is unfortunately that our friend that we talked about didn't have. you can't do that. I mean, if, you know, everybody talks about the golden years. It's not, they're tarnished years. And because if you're used to being on a fast track and then you slow yourself down and you lose all your, and you become passive rather than active, you were made for an active life. I was made for an active life. And you've got to continue that as long as the good Lord gives you the health and energy to go along with it.
So in '83, you leave this company, and is that when you come out here, or when's the first time you started coming to the desert?
My wife's mother-in-law, excuse me, my mother-in-law, my wife's mother, married gentleman, second husband, who her father had died in the meantime. The second marriage was with a guy that was very active at Tamara's Country Club. And
Who was that?
his name was Sam Greenfield. And he had a place at Potencio in Palm Springs. So my wife used to come out here, and then she got me to buy a little place at the Springs.
When was that?
That was in 1982, just before I left the corporation.
Springs was just kind of getting started.
They were
about
just
that.
getting started, that's right. And her mother, her second husband died, so she moved into Springs, and my wife also bought a place not too far from her. So she used to come out to see her there, and I came out very infrequently, to say the least. Because what happened with me, I didn't, for about, from the early 80s to 90, I just didn't know what I was going to do. So yeah, I did a little writing for some of the trade magazine, but I was in a vacuum at that particular point. Well,
Were you active in politics in those years, even when you were?
That's a very good question. When I was in business, I stayed out of it very much so, because, you know, when you're doing business, I don't care what your politics are. You can give me an order. I don't care who you are or what you are. If your checks don't bounce, I'll do business with you.
Yeah.
No, I was not. I mean, I was, when I was president of the school board, my politics became quite obvious, because I refused to participate in busing. I refused multicultural education. Every book on the shelf of the school had to be approved by me personally. I suppose I was the same kind of guy that is now mayor of Chicago. What's his name? You know, he was the chief of staff of
Oh,
Obama.
right. Yeah.
Rahm Emanuel, yeah. You know, who now has the 85% popularity rating, because Chicago needs a dictator. I mean, that's, Old Man Daley was a perfect example. And this guy, when they started having these flash mobs and so on, or this Occupation Wall Street, I mean, he cracks heads. He tells the police, get the job done, and I don't care how you do it. And they have his full support, and the guy is so popular, you can't believe it. That's the way I ran the Board of Education, and everybody who was, other than the lefties out there, everybody loved me, because I was, education was doing great, and they were very upset when I finally left after 9 years. Then we moved to downtown Chicago, about the time, just a couple of years before I left the corporation. So, and then I say there was a hiatus of about 10 years. So, interestingly, at the same time that I got involved with television out here, that was my first thing. We had a show with two brokers, one a stockbroker and one a bonds guy, and we had a show for time. At that time it was Palm Springs, Palmer Cable. I think they went through different ownership, and we had our own show. That didn't last because we were supposed to get our own advertising. But then I went over to KSQ, and I did some, then I got over to then I did radio work at, first over at K-News, and then now at KPSI. Got to know Rosine Supple real well.
Yeah. Do you like TV or radio better?
TV. Yeah. Oh, no question about it. Because TV, I feel I have done something that's very hard to do. You know, you can have an hour-long radio show, but TV, it gives me, just like you're doing with me now. I have a partner who, every 3 weeks we update it. If you'll see it, you'll know what I mean. We get into all the basic things, and there's no time. You can't, like we're talking, I got to give you quick responses. Don't have to. We get away with it here because you'll edit it, but you can't do that on television. And I started actually my television in Chicago before I came out. I forgot to mention that there was a cattle call from a local TV station that wanted one of the members of the Young Prisoners Organization. And they had a program called the Market Basket. And I never thought I'd get it. And to my surprise, because I figured there'd be 100 people applying for it, I was the only one that applied. Business people don't like those kind of jobs. You know, when you're top, or when you're CEO of a company, you're used to having people do what you tell them to do, but they're not good at ad-libbing and having a TV type of personality. So I did that, and then even before, when I came out here, we had a show made up of about 5 guys, all of whom are distinguished themselves now in business television, and even while I was out here, they had me on by simulcasting and also on the telephone. So it just sort of evolved, and I got into radio, and I got with the newspaper. I wrote some articles, and then I got to know the editor, and at the time, I think there was a Vicky something or other, I forgot her last name. She wanted me to start writing on business. Before I knew it, I was writing a regular column. And then 3 years ago, they asked me to do a daily blog. No, they didn't say daily, they said periodic. It turned out to be daily. And this was because Gannett is big on online. And I'm by far the most widely read online person that they have.
Are any of your shows geared towards politics?
I would say the Time Warner show has a very good dollop of politics in it. I tell you, I'm so thrilled about it because the gal that's in charge of the studio says it's the hottest show they've got going, and said that, you know, not to diminish anybody else, but most of the shows that come out of here, you know, interviewing former movie stars and so on. And this is more like what they would expect from the network. Mm-hmm. And it's an hour show that started at a half hour. They wanted us to extend it to an hour. And they just keep it going every day.
And how much preparation for each show, let's say, do you do in advance?
Do I have to answer that question?
No.
No, I'm saying that to be cute.
Yeah.
I don't do any. I'd say about my partner agendizes it. He's a whiz on the computer, which I'm not, and he's like 42 years old. He's in the hearing aid business, and he sets up the agenda. And he really has an in-depth knowledge of how to get information. And he's in the Republican circles, and he's met a lot of the people. He's a good friend of some of the top Republicans, both locally here and even nationally. So put the two of us together, he uses me as a man with the answers.
Have you kept up on the psychological warfare over the past few years, how it's changed and what they're dealing with
it
now?
has. Well, I think once Eisenhower got, after the 1956 Hungarian uprising where we didn't do anything, you know, rolling back the Iron Curtain, which I don't think we never had any intention, it sort of diminished. It wasn't the high profile aspect of the Army that it had been. What I learn of it, it isn't doing very much. It may be doing more than I'm saying, but I'm just what I know of it. I think they still are located in Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
Yeah.
Before they had it at Fort Riley, Kansas, and then they moved it to Fort Bragg. But I think it's still there.
Do you feel it's not as necessary now as it was then, or what?
Well, I think there it became very much part of the military. see, remember, we had a war situation going, and then we had the Cold War, and I think now whatever is done as far as propaganda, is the Radio Free Europe and what comes out of the White House, what comes out of Congress, I don't think they use the military anymore for that kind of work.
And since you were active during Korea, do you think that was handled well, or do you think it was worthwhile?
I would say at the time I thought it was we were taking terrible chances, and when MacArthur was talking about bombing Manchuria, I think we were, before he died, he said never get involved again on a land war in Asia. Of course, Johnson ignored that and got us involved in Vietnam. So I would say the fact that South Korea has become one of the great economies of the world and an absolute example of free enterprise capitalism as opposed to communism, from that standpoint, I think it's been a huge success.
Okay. And where do you live now?
Ranch Mirage on Tamarisk Lane.
Okay.
On the you're at Mission Hills, you go right down Inverness Lane, and you go down to Los Alamos, and we're on the corner of Los Alamos and Tamarisk Lane.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And how long you been there?
21 years.
And are you a member at Tamarisk?
Yes, but not a very active one.
Did you used to play golf there?
Yeah, I play golf there.
Yeah.
You have a way. Are you a psychologist? Well, I'll tell you. You have a way of getting me to talk about how I really feel about it. And it's unfair, I guess, but to be judgmental. But I stay away from big dinners and so on. I've gotten to the point, I have enough lectures that are requested of me and things that I do. My wife said, well, you can't always be on the soapbox. I know, I don't go looking for it. I'm asked to participate. When Bob asked me to do this, man, I jumped because this is right up my alley, as you can tell. And I've been able to tell the story I've never been able to tell my story as comprehensively as the way you've guided me here today.
That's good. I guess similar to you in some ways. I know, well, because I've retired now, but all the time I practice, somebody would be calling me to go to lunch, and I would I just didn't. I didn't care. I'd rather be, instead of just going there and chatting with someone who is a nice person or whatever, I'd rather be on my lunch or on the driving range or doing something else.
I think we got that in common.
Yeah,
I really do. I really do. I can sense a compatriot when I see him.
And in the office, I didn't like sitting around not doing anything. I wanted to get in, get out, and then go do whatever I wanted to do. So
the thing I'm doing now, I've got 6 clients in my industry that I write. Not only my own newsletter, I write a monthly newsletter for 2 of the clients. They're a little different. I found myself, I don't know where I get time to do it. Before I got here this morning, I had already written a blog. I've got about 6 in the can. And I got to talk about one of my clients said, why haven't you ever written about the fact that Boeing wasn't able to move their manufacturing the Dreamliner from Washington to South Carolina? I said, that's a great idea. So I wrote about 600 words on it this morning.
That's amazing, yeah. And your health, how's your health been?
Well, I'll give you an example. Dr. Phil Shaver?
Oh, yeah. Very well.
And my wife has had a little bit of a heart problem, lymphoma and so on. And I bumped into him at various functions over the years. And one day, about a month ago, he said to Ruth, how come I don't see your husband? I said, what do you mean? He's on television. No, I don't mean that. I know that, but why doesn't he come over to see me? I said, well, why would he come over to see you? He said, well, who's this cardiologist? He says, are you kidding? He doesn't even have a heart. She's funny that way. I mean, she'll come up with these one-liners.
Phil, I knew him. When we were members of Sunrise Country Club back in the late 70s and played tennis together. And one year they had, and Lindy and I were in the Probst building at Eisenhower.
Oh, yeah, yes.
We were the first ones into that Probst building in 1972, 73. So, and Phil was with the cardiology group there at the time. And so they had a tennis tournament for all the Eisenhower, and so he and I were doubles partners, and we won the doubles championship at Eisenhower, and I still have that plaque. So Phil and I go back a long ways.
Yeah, he was a captain in the Navy, wasn't he?
I think he was,
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah, yeah. Well, I think maybe we're about ready to wrap it up. Anything you'd like to add here, Morrie?
Well, I would like to add this. I think it's a great thing if somebody has talent and has the energy and the desire, and there's no automatic age which says that you must retire. That's, the two of us certainly subscribe to that principle, and we're not saying that everybody, maybe only a few do, but from people that I know, those that suddenly stop doing things that are active, when they have been active most of their life professionally in business and whatever, academia, whatever, and suddenly you put the brakes on and you just sort of go along. You can't go from being an activist to a passive person overnight. You can't do that, and I think that becomes a real problem. And I'm not saying some people have unfortunate physical problems. I've been blessed with the fact I got a skin cancer. I probably was born to roam around in the Black Forest, not to come out here. But the point is, you ask me, and the only thing I can say that that is congenital, I guess, is I get a case of prostatitis every now and then. But I take care of myself. When something happens, I get checked up. I have a boutique doctor, Dr. St. Louis, Peter St. Louis, and he gives me in fact, I'm supposed to see the eye doctor, Schwartz. You know him. He's an ophthalmologist.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, he's very, very good. Now he's got me on 6 months. He says, last time I saw him, he says, well, your cataracts are still embryonic. And in fact, they're immature. But that's the only part of you that's immature. You don't know me that well. I said, well, how old do you have to be to get cataracts? He said, most people get them by the time they're in their 70s. So far, I haven't. What about, have you had?
Cataracts? No.
You see what I mean? Now, I'm not saying that being active keeps you from having cataracts, but I actually, it's a strange thing. I have an astigmatism that was operated on in my left eye, and I don't have 20/20 on my left eye, but I can see everything up close with my left eye. In my right eye, I got 20/20 vision.
That's great. Yeah.
So he said, if he tells me I need it, it's a simple procedure today, I'll just go ahead and do it.
Sure. Yeah. Morrie, want to thank you for your service to our country,
Thank
and
you.
thanks for coming in and sharing with us today. It was just really great.
This
I really
is
enjoyed
just
it.
great. So what's the chronology that follows this?
Well, I will take, here, let me shut this down here, and this oven up here. Okay, I've got a couple tapes here, but I also have a DVD that's been going here. And so we're like 2 hours and 42 minutes
Wow.
on the site. So that's kind of my master, and I'll stop this.